I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in Texas history. It is the story of Farian Wardrip, a man who lived an ordinary life on the surface while hiding monstrous acts beneath it. Between 1984 and 1986, he murdered 5 women in a series of brutal crimes that terrorized small communities and left families grieving without answers. For years, his identity remained a mystery. Another man was even wrongfully convicted of one of the murders. It was only through the slow and patient advances of forensic science that the truth finally emerged more than a decade later. This is the chilling story of how a quiet man with a smile became one of Texas's most dangerous predators. Farian Edward Wardrip was born in 1959 in Salem, Indiana. His early years were not unusual. He grew up in a middle-class family, raised by parents who worked hard and provided for their children. By all outward appearances, his childhood was stable. He played sports, attended church, and showed no clear signs of the violence that would later define him. Teachers and neighbors remembered him as a polite boy who did not stand out much. But as he grew older, subtle cracks appeared. He struggled with discipline. He quit high school before graduation and drifted between jobs. There was no strong direction in his life, and soon he turned to alcohol and drugs for escape. In the early 1980s, he moved to Wichita Falls, Texas. He married and tried to build a normal life with his wife and their young child. He found work in manufacturing plants and as a janitor. To the outside world, he was just another working man trying to support a family. But behind closed doors, his marriage was turbulent. He drank heavily, used drugs, and argued constantly with his wife. The relationship collapsed and ended in divorce. This failure seemed to deepen his sense of anger and isolation. Wardrip drifted further into instability. He had no strong career, no close support system, and carried resentment toward women who he believed had rejected or wronged him. It was in this state that his violent impulses first erupted. In December 1984, 20-year-old nurse Terry Sims was attacked in her apartment in Wichita Falls. She was found bound and stabbed to death, her home ransacked. The brutality shocked investigators. Sims was young, caring, and had no known enemies. Her family was left devastated, struggling to understand why she was targeted. Police worked the case tirelessly, but with no witnesses and limited forensic technology at the time, they reached dead ends. For months, the community lived in fear, but no arrest came. Just weeks later, in January 1985, another young woman was murdered. Toni Gibbs, also a nurse, vanished after leaving her job. Her body was discovered in a rural area outside Wichita Falls. Like Sims, she had been sexually assaulted and killed in a manner that showed rage and control. The similarities alarmed investigators. It became clear they were facing a predator targeting women in the area. Families grew fearful. Nurses and young women in particular felt unsafe. The city that had once felt quiet and safe was now gripped by anxiety. In March 1985, Deborah Taylor, a single mother, disappeared after a night out. She too was later found murdered, her body abandoned in the countryside. The killings were spreading beyond Wichita Falls, but the method was chillingly consistent. Each victim was young, vulnerable, and attacked with overwhelming violence. Yet police could not find a suspect. Forensic science in the mid-1980s had not yet developed the DNA tools that would later prove crucial. Investigators relied on fingerprints, eyewitness accounts, and physical evidence, but Wardrip left little behind. He blended back into ordinary life after each killing, unnoticed and unsuspected. The following year, he struck again. In May 1986, 21-year-old Ellen Blau disappeared after leaving a friend's house in Wichita Falls. Her car was found abandoned, and her body was later recovered in a field. Like the others, she had been assaulted and murdered with ruthless force. The fear that had been simmering now boiled over. Parents warned their daughters not to go out alone. Women walked in groups. Police increased patrols, but there was no clear suspect. The final known victim was 21-year-old Tina Kimbrough. In September 1986, she was found strangled in her apartment. Unlike the other murders, this case unfolded differently. Soon after the killing, Wardrip called a friend and confessed. He was arrested and charged. At the time, authorities believed this was a single isolated crime. No one connected him to the earlier murders. Wardrop pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. The community believed justice had been served, not knowing that 4 other families still had no answers because their daughters had also been killed by the same man. In prison, Wardrop kept a low profile. He worked, attended church services, and eventually earned early release after serving only 11 years of a sentence. In 1997, he walked free, claiming he had turned his life around. He remarried, found steady work, and presented himself as a reformed man. He even attended church regularly and volunteered in the community. People saw him as quiet and friendly. Few imagined that a man convicted of one murder might be responsible for several others. But science had advanced since the mid-1980s. DNA profiling was now a powerful investigative tool. Cold case detectives in Texas began reopening unsolved murders from that decade. They re-examined evidence collected from the crime scenes of Terry Sims and Tony Gibbs. Semen samples preserved at the time were now tested with modern DNA methods. The results revealed a single unknown profile. Investigators built a suspect list and eventually focused on Wardrop because of his prior conviction for murder in the same area and time period. Detectives began quietly watching him. They followed him, learned his routines, and collected a discarded coffee cup to test his DNA. The result was conclusive. His DNA matched the samples from the unsolved cases. In 1999, more than a decade after the murders, Farian Wardrop was arrested. The news shocked the community once again. A man they now knew as a seemingly reformed churchgoer and family man was in fact a serial killer responsible for at least 5 murders. The investigation revealed another tragic layer. In one of the murders, another man, Danny Laughlin, had been wrongfully accused and even convicted before DNA evidence cleared him. He had spent years under suspicion and stigma for a crime committed by Wardrop. The revelation added to the outrage and heartbreak. Families who had waited so long for answers now faced the truth that the killer had been free, living among them, for years after his first release. In 1999, Wardrop was charged with multiple counts of capital murder. Faced with overwhelming DNA evidence, he confessed in detail to 5 killings between 1984 and 1986. His confessions were chillingly calm. He described how he selected his victims, how he felt anger and a need for control, and how he returned to ordinary life after each killing. There was no deep explanation for his actions beyond rage and a desire for domination. The randomness of his choices made the crimes even more terrifying. In 1999, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most haunting crime sprees in American history. It is the story of Herbert Richard Baumeister, a man who lived a double life. By day, he was a businessman, a husband, and a father raising 3 children in the suburbs of Indianapolis. But by night, he was something very different. He prowled the bars and clubs of the city, preying on young men who trusted him. He lured them back to his sprawling estate, Fox Hollow Farm, where he murdered them and buried or burned their remains. For years, men vanished, families grieved, and police struggled to understand what was happening. The truth, when it finally emerged, revealed a story of wealth and respectability hiding unimaginable horror. Herb Baumeister was born in 1947 in Indianapolis, Indiana. His early childhood was outwardly ordinary. He came from a middle-class family, the eldest of 4 children. His father was an anesthesiologist and his mother a homemaker. But from a young age, Herb displayed behaviors that unsettled those around him. He was socially awkward, prone to inappropriate remarks, and fascinated by death. As a boy, he was known to place dead animals in strange positions, sometimes playing with them in ways that disturbed his peers. He laughed at things others found grim. Teachers noted his intelligence, but also his strangeness. His father eventually sought psychiatric help for him. Doctors suggested possible schizophrenia or other personality disorders, but treatment was limited and Herb was never formally diagnosed or given lasting therapy. During his teenage years, he withdrew further. He struggled to maintain friendships and was sometimes bullied. He made efforts to fit in, but often said or did things that alienated classmates. He developed a reputation as odd and unpredictable. At the same time, he tried to present himself as a hard worker. He ran errands, helped his father, and took pride in appearing serious. But beneath the surface, his fascination with control and morbidity was growing stronger. In early adulthood, Herb attempted to build a conventional life. He enrolled at Indiana University, but dropped out before completing a degree. He drifted between jobs and eventually married a woman named Juliana in 1971. She was a schoolteacher, bright and optimistic, and she believed she could build a life with him. Together, they had 3 children and settled into suburban Indianapolis. For years, they appeared to be a stable family. Herb worked various jobs, sometimes in the newspaper business, other times in retail. Eventually, he founded a chain of thrift stores called Save-A-Lot, which became moderately successful. The income gave him respect and status. He purchased a large property called Fox Hollow Farm, a mansion on 18 acres of land outside the city. Neighbors saw him as eccentric but respectable. He landscaped the grounds, maintained his stores, and attended social events. Yet inside the marriage there was distance and strain. Juliana later recalled long stretches without intimacy, sudden mood swings, and unexplained disappearances. Herb often left for hours or days, claiming business or stress, but never fully explaining where he went. He drank heavily and became erratic. Still, Juliana stayed, trying to keep the family together for the sake of the children. In the 1980s and early 1990s, young men began vanishing from Indianapolis. Most were gay men or men who frequented gay bars. They disappeared after nights out, their last known sightings often near the same clubs. Families reported them missing, but police were slow to connect the cases. At the time, there was limited awareness of crimes against gay men, and prejudice sometimes led authorities to dismiss disappearances as voluntary. Rumors circulated in the community, but no clear suspect emerged. During these same years, Herb was living a secret life. He began visiting the very bars where the men were last seen. He approached young men, often offering them drinks or companionship. He presented himself as friendly, sometimes fatherly, sometimes flirtatious. Many trusted him enough to accept a ride. Those who entered his car often never returned. Herb would bring them to Fox Hollow Farm, where he killed them and disposed of their remains on his property. Some evidence later suggested he strangled his victims during sex, finding control and domination in the act of murder. Juliana began to notice signs that something was deeply wrong. She found gay pornography hidden in the house. She discovered mannequins dressed in men's clothing positioned around the pool house. On one occasion, while her children were playing in the yard, she stumbled upon a bone that appeared human. Herb dismissed it, claiming it was from an old medical skeleton used in anatomy classes. She wanted to believe him, but doubt began to gnaw at her. By the mid-1990s, police were growing more suspicious. They had finally begun to see a pattern in the disappearances. A private investigator hired by families of missing men connected several cases to the same area and the same individual, Herb Baumeister. Detectives tried to question him, but Juliana refused to grant access to the property without Herb's consent. Herb himself grew defensive and angry whenever asked about the missing men. In 1996, Juliana reached a breaking point. Their marriage was collapsing under the weight of his secrecy and odd behavior. When Herb went on a trip with their son, she allowed investigators onto Fox Hollow Farm. What they found confirmed the darkest suspicions. Scattered across the wooded grounds and inside shallow graves were thousands of charred and broken bone fragments. Forensic teams sifted through soil and ash, uncovering the remains of at least 11 men. The sheer scale of the discovery stunned even seasoned detectives. They realized the property had been a graveyard for years. When Herb learned the police were closing in, he fled. He drove north through Indiana and into Canada, leaving his family behind. For several days, he evaded capture, sleeping in his car and moving between small towns. In July 1996, he parked near Lake Huron. There he wrote a note blaming business problems and marital troubles, but never admitting to murder. He then took his own life with a gunshot. Campers later discovered his body in the woods. With his death, the full truth of his crimes died with him. Investigators continued to examine Fox Hollow Farm for years. They confirmed at least 11 victims, but suspected as many as 20 or more. Many families of missing men never received final confirmation. The remains were too fragmented to identify everyone. The aftermath left deep scars. Juliana and her children were forced to confront the reality that the man they lived with had been a serial killer. Neighbors struggled with the knowledge that behind the gates of Fox Hollow Farm, unspeakable acts had been carried out. The gay community of Indianapolis, already marginalized, had to face the reality that dozens of their friends and loved ones had been preyed upon while authorities were slow to take their disappearances seriously. Herb Baumeister's case is remembered as one of the most chilling examples of a hidden predator. To the world, he was a businessman, a father, a member of the community. In secret, he was a man who turned his home into a killing ground. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in Ohio history. It is the story of Anthony Sowell, a man whose outward appearance was quiet and unassuming, yet who secretly committed unspeakable acts for years. Between 2007 and 2009, he murdered at least 11 women, hiding their bodies in his home and around his property in Cleveland. Neighbors complained of foul odors, strange behavior, and unusual activity, but no one suspected the horror that lay inside. The revelations of his crimes shocked the city and left a lasting scar on the community. Anthony Sowell was born in 1959 in Ohio. His childhood was troubled from the start. He was the eldest of several children in a family struggling with poverty and instability. His father was abusive and often absent, while his mother tried to maintain a household under difficult circumstances. As a boy, Anthony witnessed violence, neglect, and erratic behavior that left deep impressions on him. He had trouble in school, often acting out and struggling to form friendships. Teachers described him as quiet at times and aggressive at others. He had early encounters with the law, including petty theft and fighting, which signaled the beginnings of troubled path. As a teenager, he showed signs of both charm and danger. He could be polite, helpful, and engaging, yet his temper was quick and his impulses were unpredictable. He began experimenting with alcohol and drugs, often getting into trouble at school and in the neighborhood. Despite these problems, he found work at various local businesses and tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. In adulthood, Sowell's life remained unstable. He married and had children, but the marriage was troubled and eventually ended in divorce. He held a variety of jobs, including factory work, but struggled to maintain steady employment. Neighbors described him as quiet and often keeping to himself. He was known to drink heavily and occasionally became aggressive, but nothing suggested the scale of the violence he would later commit. The murders began around 2007. Sowell targeted women who were vulnerable, often those struggling with addiction or sex work. He lured them to his home or nearby locations, where he restrained, assaulted, and murdered them. After killing his victims, he concealed their bodies in his house, sometimes wrapping them in blankets and hiding them behind walls or in closets. In other cases, he left bodies outside on his property. The decomposing bodies produced odors that neighbors noticed, prompting complaints to the city, but officials failed to take decisive action. Sowell's outward appearance of normalcy allowed him to continue undetected for years. Neighbors described a pattern of disturbing behavior. Sowell would often stand outside his house for long periods, staring into the street or at passersby. Neighbors complained about the stench of decay, but inspections initially revealed no clear evidence of wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Sowell's victims continued to disappear. Friends and families reported the missing, but in many cases the women were marginalized by society, and police initially treated the cases as runaways. The investigation began to gain traction in 2009. Police received credible tips and complaints about the odors, combined with reports of missing women. Authorities obtained a search warrant for Sowell's home. and what they found was horrifying. Inside, they discovered multiple decomposed bodies hidden behind walls, in closets, and in various parts of the property. The scale of the crime was staggering. 11 women were ultimately identified as his victims, though the full extent of his crimes may never be known. Anthony Sowell was arrested immediately. During questioning, he confessed to the murders and gave details about his methods, showing no visible remorse. He described how he selected his victims, how he lured them, and how he concealed the evidence. His calm recounting of horrific acts disturbed investigators and the public alike. Sowell was charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and other related offenses. The trial began in 2011, and the evidence against Sowell was overwhelming. Witnesses included neighbors who had complained about the odors, family members of victims, and law enforcement officers involved in the investigation. Forensic evidence, including DNA, confirmed his responsibility for the murders. Sowell's lack of remorse and methodical planning made a deep impression on the jury. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death, a sentence he would carry until his death in prison in 2021. The aftermath of Sowell's crimes left a lasting impact on Cleveland. Families of the victims struggled to process the loss and the years of uncertainty. Neighbors expressed outrage that the city and police had not acted sooner despite warnings about the odors and suspicious behavior. The case highlighted failures in social services, law enforcement, and community response, particularly regarding marginalized women. Sowell's ability to hide his crimes for years in plain sight became a grim lesson in how appearances can be deceiving and how violence can thrive unnoticed when victims are overlooked. Anthony Sowell's story is remembered as a chilling example of hidden evil. To the outside world, he was a quiet, unassuming man. Behind closed doors, he was a predator who ended the lives of 11 women and caused untold suffering. His crimes exposed vulnerabilities in society and law enforcement, and his name remains synonymous with terror and the consequences of overlooking warning signs. This is the story of Anthony Sowell, the Cleveland Strangler, a man who lived an ordinary life in public while committing horrific murders in private. It is a reminder of how darkness can hide behind the most familiar faces, and how vigilance and compassion are essential to prevent such tragedies. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most chilling and elusive killers in modern American history. It is the story of Angel Maturino Resendez, a man whose crimes spanned hundreds of miles and left a trail of terror across multiple states. He became known as the Railroad Killer because he used trains to travel swiftly, striking at victims without warning and vanishing before authorities could apprehend him. Between 1990 and 1999, he murdered at least 15 people, though some investigators believe the number was higher. His case is remarkable not only for the brutality of his acts, but also for his ability to evade capture for nearly a decade. Angel Maturino Resendez was born in 1959 in Ecatepec, Mexico. His early life was marred by poverty, neglect, and abuse. From a young age, he experienced instability at home. He witnessed violence, and his father was often absent. Angel quickly learned to survive by his wits and by hiding his true feelings. He began stealing as a child and developed a habit of lying and manipulation to avoid punishment. Teachers and neighbors noticed his troubling behavior, but assumed it was typical of a troubled youth. As a teenager, he began to drift. He hopped trains, crossed borders, and developed a transient lifestyle. He experimented with drugs and alcohol and became increasingly distant from family and community. By his late teens, he had been arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and minor assaults. He was known for being both charming and threatening, able to ingratiate himself with strangers while maintaining a streak of violence beneath the surface. Resendez moved to the United States in the 1980s, crossing the border illegally. He found occasional work as a laborer, but quickly learned that life on the move suited him better. He adopted a nomadic lifestyle, traveling primarily by freight trains, which allowed him to avoid detection. This mobility became a key component of his crimes, enabling him to attack victims in multiple states while remaining largely anonymous. His first known murders occurred in the early 1990s. Angel targeted men and women he encountered along railroad tracks or in transient communities. He often used deception to lure his victims, offering rides, money, or work. Once isolated, he attacked with extreme violence, sometimes strangling, stabbing, or bludgeoning. His choice of victims often seemed random, and the lack of a clear pattern made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to connect the murders at first. As the years passed, reports of disappearances and suspicious deaths grew in multiple states, including Texas, Illinois, Ohio, and Florida. Victims were found near rail lines, abandoned buildings, or wooded areas, often showing signs of sexual assault and extreme violence. The geographic spread and randomness of the attacks created widespread fear. Communities were unsettled, unable to predict where the next attack might occur or who might be targeted. Resendez's nomadic habits allowed him to elude capture repeatedly. He was arrested briefly for minor offenses, but quickly released each time, continuing his pattern of travel and murder. He became more brazen over time, leaving clues in some cases, but also ensuring they were difficult to trace. Law enforcement in different states began to notice similarities in the killings, but struggled to share information effectively due to the lack of digital databases and communication at the time. In 1999, a breakthrough came when Resendez was finally apprehended in Texas following an attempted murder of a woman he tried to strangle. He was captured near a railroad yard, and police quickly realized the significance of the arrest. His confession was chillingly calm. He admitted to numerous murders across the country, describing his methods in detail. Investigators confirmed at least 15 murders, though the full extent may never be known. He explained that he traveled by train to avoid capture and chose victims opportunistically, often targeting vulnerable individuals whom no one would immediately notice were missing. The trial revealed more about his psychology and motivations. Resendez appeared detached as he recounted his crimes, showing little empathy for his victims. Experts described him as a narcissistic and antisocial individual with a capacity for extreme violence. The scale and mobility of his crimes made him an exceptionally dangerous and unpredictable predator. The court sentenced him to death for multiple counts of murder. In 2006, Angel Maturino Resendez was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas, bringing an end to the life of one of the most elusive killers in U.S. history. The aftermath of his crimes left communities across multiple states grappling with fear and grief. Families of victims struggled with the knowledge that their loved ones were killed by a man who had moved invisibly across the country. Law enforcement agencies reviewed procedures for tracking mobile criminals and improved communication across jurisdictions to prevent similar cases. Resendez's ability to hide in plain sight and travel with impunity highlighted vulnerabilities in the system and left lasting lessons for investigators. Angel Maturino Resendez's story is remembered as a case of extreme cunning, mobility, and brutality. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like just another transient man, but beneath the surface, he was a calculating and deadly predator. His crimes demonstrate how violence can spread silently across large distances when combined with planning, mobility, and a lack of coordination between authorities. This is the story of Angel Maturino Resendez, the railroad killer, a man who traveled across states, hunting unsuspecting victims and leaving fear in his wake. His case reminds us that danger can move unseen and that even ordinary places can harbor extraordinary terror. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in American history. It is the story of Dean Corll, a man who came to be known as the Candyman. In the early 1970s, he and two teenage accomplices carried out one of the largest series of child murders in United States history. For years, boys and young men vanished from the neighborhoods of Houston, Texas. Families searched and begged for answers, while the crimes continued in secret. When the truth was finally revealed, it shocked an entire nation and left scars that would never heal. Dean Corll was born in 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His childhood was marked by instability. His parents had a troubled marriage, separating and reuniting several times. Dean was a shy child, often keeping to himself. Teachers described him as polite and quiet, but he struggled to form close friendships. He showed little interest in sports or group activities. Instead, he helped around the house and worked part-time jobs. When he was a teenager, the family moved to Houston, Texas. His mother started a small candy company, and Dean worked alongside her. He helped make the candy and deliver it around the neighborhood. Children came to know him as the friendly candy man, someone who gave out sweets for free. This role would later form part of his disturbing reputation. After finishing high school, Dean worked various jobs. He served briefly in the Army, but was discharged after less than a year due to complaints of illness and difficulty adjusting. Returning to Houston, he resumed working in the family candy business. Outwardly, he seemed normal. Neighbors saw him as quiet and hardworking. But beneath the surface, his life was increasingly isolated. He had few close friends and lived much of the time with his mother. By the late 1960s, Dean had developed a troubling habit of befriending teenage boys in the neighborhood. He gave them candy, offered them rides, and invited them into his home. He gained their trust by appearing generous and approachable. Parents thought of him as eccentric but harmless. No one imagined that behind his soft voice and polite manners lay a predatory nature that would soon erupt in violence. The crimes began in 1970. Dean Corll recruited two teenage boys from the neighborhood, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. Both came from troubled homes and were drawn to Dean's attention and gifts. Corll groomed them, offering money, alcohol, and a sense of belonging. Over time, he manipulated them into helping him lure other boys. At first, the disappearances seemed isolated. A boy would go missing after walking home from school. Another would vanish after leaving a party. Parents searched desperately, but police often dismissed the cases as runaways. In Houston at the time, teenage boys disappearing was not treated with the urgency it deserved. Corll exploited this indifference. Inside his modest rented homes, Corll built a soundproof room and created a horrifying environment. Victims were tied to wooden boards and restrained with handcuffs and nylon rope. He devised methods of torture that showed a cold, methodical cruelty. For hours or even days, the boys suffered before their lives were taken. Corll's crimes were not random acts of rage. They were planned rituals repeated again and again. David Brooks, the first of his young accomplices, initially believed he was helping Corll cover up minor crimes. Over time, he realized the full horror, but was trapped by fear and manipulation. Elmer Wayne Henley, recruited a little later, was even more deeply involved. Both boys were paid to deliver victims to Corll. Sometimes they lured friends or classmates, betraying the very people they knew. By 1971, disappearances in Houston's Heights neighborhood had become disturbingly frequent. Entire families were devastated. Mothers plastered telephone poles with missing posters. Fathers searched the streets at night. Yet police continued to categorize the boys as runaways. In an era before organized missing persons units, the pattern went unnoticed. For Dean Corll, this lack of attention gave him freedom to continue. The victims ranged from 13 to 20 years old. Many were hitchhikers. Others were taken while walking home from school or from a party. Some were offered jobs or money by Henley or Brooks. Once inside Corll's home, their fate was sealed. The killings continued for years, unnoticed by the wider public. Corll developed a system for disposing of bodies. With the help of Henley and Brooks, he buried the victims in remote locations around Houston. Several were interred on a rented boat shed that Corll owned. Others were buried along the beaches of the Gulf Coast or in woodland areas. Shallow graves marked the final resting place of dozens of young men. Henley and Brooks grew increasingly involved. At times they expressed doubts, but Corll's hold over them was strong. He used money, threats, and psychological pressure to keep them loyal. For young teenagers with troubled homes, Corll provided a twisted form of authority and purpose. They became not only accomplices, but also enablers of his spree. By 1972 and 1973, the number of victims had risen dramatically. Boys disappeared in clusters. Friends of earlier victims vanished in the same way. Communities whispered, but few could imagine the scale of what was happening. Corll had become one of the most prolific killers in American history, though no one yet knew his name. The reign of terror ended in August 1973 in a shocking turn of events. On the night of August 8th, Henley brought two teenage friends, a boy and a girl, to Corll's home. He believed Corll would tolerate their presence. Instead, Corll reacted with fury. He tied up all three at gunpoint, threatening their lives. For hours he raged, declaring that he would kill them all. Henley, realizing that his own life was in danger, pleaded for release. Corll reluctantly untied him, ordering him to continue restraining the others. But in that moment, Henley saw an opportunity. He grabbed Corll's gun. In the struggle that followed, he fired multiple shots. Dean Corll collapsed and died on the floor of his own home. The man who had terrorized Houston for years was killed not by police, but by one of the teenagers he had manipulated. In the immediate aftermath, Henley called the police. What officers discovered shocked them beyond imagination. Inside Corll's home, they found the restraints, the boards, the tools of torture. Henley quickly confessed, describing the years of abductions and murders. He led investigators to burial sites. Brooks was soon arrested as well, and the full story began to emerge. As police excavated the sites, body after body was uncovered. The grim discoveries continued for weeks. In total, at least 28 young men and boys were confirmed victims, though some believe the number was higher. The horror of the killings stunned Houston. Families who had lived for years with unanswered questions finally received devastating confirmation. Their children had not run away. They had been murdered by the man everyone called the Candyman. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the strangest and most chilling killing sprees in American history. It is the story of Herbert Mullen, a man who believed he was saving California from disaster by taking lives. In the early 1970s, he murdered 13 people in and around Santa Cruz. His crimes shocked a community already unsettled by other serial killers and left behind haunting questions about untreated mental illness, the failures of institutions, and the thin line between delusion and destruction. Herbert Mullen was born in 1947 in Salinas, California. His family later moved to the small town of Felton near Santa Cruz. From the outside, his childhood appeared normal. His father was a veteran and a stern but supportive figure, while his mother cared for the household. Herbert was described as polite and intelligent, though shy. He was an average student, well-liked by teachers. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. He struggled to connect with peers and often seemed withdrawn. In high school, when a close friend died in a car accident, the event left a lasting scar. He became fixated on death, increasingly anxious about the fragility of life. After graduation, he tried to build a normal future. He briefly attended college and considered a career in engineering. Yet by his early 20s, he began to show signs of severe mental illness. He heard voices, experienced paranoia, and grew convinced that disasters loomed. Doctors who examined him diagnosed schizophrenia. His family tried to help, but treatments at the time were inconsistent. Mullen moved in and out of hospitals, sometimes improving, sometimes declining. The social safety net of the late 1960s and early 1970s often failed those in need of long-term psychiatric care. Mullen slipped through the cracks. By 1972, his delusions had deepened. He became convinced that California was on the brink of a catastrophic earthquake. In his mind, human sacrifice was the only way to prevent it. He believed the voices told him when and where he must kill. To Mullen, these were not murders, but necessary acts of salvation. His descent into violence began with transients and strangers, people he believed would be acceptable sacrifices. Soon it escalated into random killings that brought terror to Santa Cruz County. The first known victim was a homeless man beaten to death with a baseball bat. Days later, Mullen stabbed a hitchhiker to death, leaving his body in the forest. These crimes attracted little attention at first. In the early 1970s, violence against marginalized people often went unnoticed. But as the killings continued, patterns of fear began to spread. Residents of Santa Cruz were already shaken because another killer Edmund Kemper, was active at the same time. The quiet coastal region gained the grim nickname of murder capital of the world. Mullen's murders became increasingly brazen. He killed a man outside his own home, claiming he was sending him telepathic messages. He murdered a Catholic priest in his confessional booth, believing the act was divinely required. He shot and killed 4 teenagers who were camping in a state park, an act that horrified the entire community. Each time he was convinced he was preventing an earthquake. He often later explained that the voices had told him exactly what he needed to do. To the people of Santa Cruz, the killings seemed random, impossible to predict or prevent. Panic spread, and families began locking doors and keeping children close. The investigation into the murders was complicated because of their apparent randomness. Police initially struggled to connect the crimes. Different jurisdictions handled different cases. Witnesses described a disheveled young man in a beat-up car, but nothing more concrete. Mullen continued killing. He murdered a fisherman, then an older man in his driveway. At times he confessed to strangers what he believed he was doing, but most dismissed it as rambling. Only later would these admissions take on their terrible meaning. The spree came to an end in February 1973. Mullen killed a man in his front yard during a dispute. A neighbor witnessed the attack and quickly called police. This time, officers arrived in time to apprehend him. He was arrested without resistance, almost relieved that the cycle had ended. In custody, he calmly explained that the voices had instructed him to perform the murders as sacrifices to prevent earthquakes. Investigators were stunned at the cold logic with which he described each killing. At his trial, the central question was insanity. His defense argued he was schizophrenic, driven entirely by delusion. The prosecution countered that despite his illness, he understood his actions were wrong and attempted to conceal them. The court heard testimony from psychiatrists on both sides. In the end, Mullen was found guilty of 10 murders and convicted of second-degree and first-degree charges. He was sentenced to life in prison. He has remained incarcerated ever since. The aftermath of Herbert Mullen's crimes left a community shaken. The randomness of his killings terrified residents who felt anyone could be a target. Families of victims grieved lives stolen without reason. The case highlighted failures in mental health care and a lack of consistent treatment for those with severe disorders. It also left Santa Cruz marked by its brief but devastating association with multiple killers operating at once. Mullen became a lasting example of what can happen when delusion and neglect converge. Herbert Mullen's story is remembered not for cruelty in the way of calculated predators, but for the unsettling reality of a mind consumed by madness. He was a man who believed he was saving lives while ending them. His crimes remind us of the fragility of the systems meant to protect the vulnerable and the dangers of ignoring signs of severe illness. In the end, 13 people lost their lives, and a community was left to wonder how many tragedies might have been prevented if help had come sooner. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest and most chilling killers in American history. His name was Robert Hansen. He was known as the Butcher Baker of Alaska. Behind the counter of his bakery, he appeared to be a shy, hard-working man. But in the frozen wilderness outside Anchorage, he lived out his secret life. He hunted women as if they were animals. He stalked them in the deep forests and tundra of Alaska where no one could hear them scream. This story is long detailed and deeply haunting. It begins far from Alaska in the childhood of a boy who would grow into one of the most feared predators the state had ever seen. Robert Hansen was born in Esterville, Iowa, in 1939. He was the son of a strict Danish immigrant father who ran a bakery. From a young age, Hansen was a shy, awkward boy. He spoke with a stutter and had severe acne that left scars on his face. In school, he was bullied and isolated. He struggled to connect with classmates, and especially with girls who often rejected him. These years planted seeds of anger and resentment deep inside him. He worked long hours in his father's bakery and developed skills that he would later use when he opened his own business in Alaska. On the surface, he seemed dutiful and obedient, but inside, he felt small and powerless. As Hansen entered his teenage years, his resentment grew. He was consumed by fantasies of revenge against those who mocked him. At the age of 18, he enlisted in the Army Reserves and later worked as an assistant drill instructor. Even there, he struggled to fit in. His stutter and awkwardness made him feel invisible and unwanted. At the same time, he began developing a fascination with hunting. The woods became his escape. He became a skilled marksman and tracker. Hunting gave him a sense of control and power that he lacked in his social life. It would become the cornerstone of his identity. Hansen's early adult years were marked by trouble. In 1960, at the age of 21, he committed arson. He set fire to a school bus garage in Pocahontas, Iowa. He was caught and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He served only 20 months, but while incarcerated, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and other personality issues. He received psychiatric treatment, but the underlying darkness inside him was never resolved. After his release, he tried to build a new life. He married a young woman, but the marriage soon collapsed. His inability to form stable relationships followed him throughout his life. By the mid-1960s, Hansen remarried, and in 1967, he moved to Anchorage, Alaska, with his new wife. At that time, Alaska was a frontier state full of opportunity for those willing to endure harsh conditions. Hansen opened a small bakery and built a modest life. He became known as a hardworking family man with children of his own. Neighbors saw him as quiet and unassuming. He also earned a reputation as an expert hunter. He broke state records for hunting and proudly displayed his trophies. To the outside world, Hansen seemed successful and ordinary. But beneath that mask, his bitterness and violent fantasies had only grown stronger. During the 1970s, Anchorage began to change. Oil money brought rapid growth. The city developed a busy nightlife that included bars, strip clubs, and sex work. Hansen began targeting women from this vulnerable community. He would pick up women, often sex workers or dancers. At first, he paid them, but then his encounters turned violent. He began to kidnap them at gunpoint. He would take them to his home, where he bound and assaulted them. If he felt they might escape or report him, he escalated further. Hansen developed a chilling routine. He would load a woman onto his small private plane. He would fly her into the wilderness far from any road or settlement. There he would release her into the forest. But this was not freedom. Hansen would hunt her like game. Armed with a rifle and a knife, he tracked his victims through the cold, unforgiving terrain. He stalked them as they begged for their lives. Few ever escaped. The Alaskan wilderness became his killing field. For years, these crimes went unnoticed. Many of his victims were women whose disappearances were rarely investigated with urgency. The transient nature of Anchorage nightlife made it easier for women to vanish without immediate suspicion. Between 1971 and 1983, Hansen killed at least 17 women, though investigators believe the true number may have been higher. He buried some of them in shallow graves across the wilderness. He marked the locations on an aviation map with tiny X marks, as if cataloging trophies of his hunts. The investigation into Hansen began in the early 1980s after several women escaped his control. One woman reported being abducted at gunpoint and described Hansen's stutter and the weapons he used. In 1983, another woman escaped from his car, wearing handcuffs, and approached police. At first, investigators struggled to believe her story because Hansen seemed so respectable. He was a married father and a business owner. But detectives began to connect her account with reports of missing women. Alaska State Troopers and the FBI launched a deeper investigation. They conducted surveillance on Hansen and eventually obtained a search warrant. What they found was damning. In his home, they discovered weapons that matched ballistics from recovered victims. They also found jewelry belonging to missing women. Most chilling of all was the aviation map with marks scattered across remote areas of Alaska. When authorities searched those sites, they found the bodies of women who had been missing for years. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Hansen confessed. He admitted to abducting and killing women, but insisted that not all the marks on the map were graves. He eventually led investigators to the locations of some victims. His calm matter-of-fact descriptions of the hunts horrified detectives. He described how he gave women a head start before pursuing them through the wilderness. In 1984, Hansen was convicted of multiple murders as well as kidnapping and assault. He was sentenced to 461 years in prison plus a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He was sent to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Alaska, where he spent the rest of his life. In 2014, at the age of 75, Hansen died in prison from natural causes. The story of Robert Hansen remains one of the most terrifying in true crime history. His ability to live a double life as a quiet baker and family man while committing atrocities in the wilderness shows the depths of human darkness. His crimes also highlight the vulnerability of marginalized women and the dangers of unchecked violence in remote places. The Alaskan landscape that many saw as beautiful and free became under his hands a place of terror and death. This is the story of Robert Hansen, the butcher baker of Alaska, a man who turned the wilderness into his hunting ground and left behind a legacy of fear that lingers even after his death. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in American history. It is the story of Dean Corll, a man who came to be known as the Candyman. In the early 1970s, he and two teenage accomplices carried out one of the largest series of child murders in United States history. For years, boys and young men vanished from the neighborhoods of Houston, Texas. Families searched and begged for answers, while the crimes continued in secret. When the truth was finally revealed, it shocked an entire nation and left scars that would never heal. Dean Corll was born in 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His childhood was marked by instability. His parents had a troubled marriage, separating and reuniting several times. Dean was a shy child, often keeping to himself. Teachers described him as polite and quiet, but he struggled to form close friendships. He showed little interest in sports or group activities. Instead, he helped around the house and worked part-time jobs. When he was a teenager, the family moved to Houston, Texas. His mother started a small candy company, and Dean worked alongside her. He helped make the candy and deliver it around the neighborhood. Children came to know him as the friendly candy man, someone who gave out sweets for free. This role would later form part of his disturbing reputation. After finishing high school, Dean worked various jobs. He served briefly in the Army, but was discharged after less than a year due to complaints of illness and difficulty adjusting. Returning to Houston, he resumed working in the family candy business. Outwardly, he seemed normal. Neighbors saw him as quiet and hardworking. But beneath the surface, his life was increasingly isolated. He had few close friends and lived much of the time with his mother. By the late 1960s, Dean had developed a troubling habit of befriending teenage boys in the neighborhood. He gave them candy, offered them rides, and invited them into his home. He gained their trust by appearing generous and approachable. Parents thought of him as eccentric but harmless. No one imagined that behind his soft voice and polite manners lay a predatory nature that would soon erupt in violence. The crimes began in 1970. Dean Corll recruited two teenage boys from the neighborhood, David Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. Both came from troubled homes and were drawn to Dean's attention and gifts. Corll groomed them, offering money, alcohol, and a sense of belonging. Over time, he manipulated them into helping him lure other boys. At first, the disappearances seemed isolated. A boy would go missing after walking home from school. Another would vanish after leaving a party. Parents searched desperately, but police often dismissed the cases as runaways. In Houston at the time, teenage boys disappearing was not treated with the urgency it deserved. Corll exploited this indifference. Inside his modest rented homes, Corll built a soundproof room and created a horrifying environment. Victims were tied to wooden boards and restrained with handcuffs and nylon rope. He devised methods of torture that showed a cold, methodical cruelty. For hours or even days, the boys suffered before their lives were taken. Corll's crimes were not random acts of rage. They were planned rituals repeated again and again. David Brooks, the first of his young accomplices, initially believed he was helping Corll cover up minor crimes. Over time, he realized the full horror, but was trapped by fear and manipulation. Elmer Wayne Henley, recruited a little later, was even more deeply involved. Both boys were paid to deliver victims to Coral. Sometimes they lured friends or classmates, betraying the very people they knew. By 1971, disappearances in Houston's Heights neighborhood had become disturbingly frequent. Entire families were devastated. Mothers plastered telephone poles with missing posters. Fathers searched the streets at night. Yet police continued to categorize the boys as runaways. In an era before organized missing persons units, the pattern went unnoticed. For Dean Coral, this lack of attention gave him freedom to continue. The victims ranged from 13 to 20 years old. Many were hitchhikers. Others were taken while walking home from school or from a party. Some were offered jobs or money by Henley or Brooks. Once inside Coral's home, their fate was sealed. The killings continued for years, unnoticed by the wider public. Coral developed a system for disposing of bodies. With the help of Henley and Brooks, he buried the victims in remote locations around Houston. Several were interred on a rented boat shed that Coral owned. Others were buried along the beaches of the Gulf Coast or in woodland areas. Shallow graves marked the final resting place of dozens of young men. Henley and Brooks grew increasingly involved. At times they expressed doubts, but Coral's hold over them was strong. He used money, threats, and psychological pressure to keep them loyal. For young teenagers with troubled homes, Coral provided a twisted form of authority and purpose. They became not only accomplices, but also enablers of his spree. By 1972 and 1973, the number of victims had risen dramatically. Boys disappeared in clusters. Friends of earlier victims vanished in the same way. Communities whispered, but few could imagine the scale of what was happening. Coral had become one of the most prolific killers in American history, though no one yet knew his name. The reign of terror ended in August 1973 in a shocking turn of events. On the night of August 8th, Henley brought two teenage friends, a boy and a girl, to Coral's home. He believed Coral would tolerate their presence. Instead, Coral reacted with fury. He tied up all three at gunpoint, threatening their lives. For hours he raged, declaring that he would kill them all. Henley, realizing that his own life was in danger, pleaded for release. Coral reluctantly untied him, ordering him to continue restraining the others. But in that moment, Henley saw an opportunity. He grabbed Coral's gun. In a struggle that followed, he fired multiple shots. Dean Coral collapsed and died on the floor of his own home. The man who had terrorized Houston for years was killed not by police, but by one of the teenagers he had manipulated. In the immediate aftermath, Henley called the police. What officers discovered shocked them beyond imagination. Inside Coral's home, they found the restraints, the boards, the tools of torture. Henley quickly confessed, describing the years of abductions and murders. He led investigators to burial sites. Brooks was soon arrested as well, and the full story began to emerge. As police excavated the sites, body after body was uncovered. The grim discoveries continued for weeks. In total, at least 28 young men and boys were confirmed victims, though some believe the number was higher. The horror of the killings stunned Houston. Families who had lived for years with unanswered questions finally received devastating confirmation. Their children had not run away. They had been murdered by the man everyone called the Candyman. Next story, I'm going to tell you the story of one of the darkest and most chilling killers in American history. His name was Robert Hansen. He was known as the Butcher Baker of Alaska. Behind the counter of his bakery, he appeared to be a shy, hard-working man. But in the frozen wilderness outside Anchorage, he lived out his secret life. He hunted women as if they were animals. He stalked them in the deep forests and tundra of Alaska where no one could hear them scream. This story is long detailed and deeply haunting. It begins far from Alaska in the childhood of a boy who would grow into one of the most feared predators the state had ever seen. Robert Hansen was born in Esterville, Iowa in 1939. He was the son of a strict Danish immigrant father who ran a bakery. From a young age, Hansen was a shy, awkward boy. He spoke with a stutter and had severe acne that left scars on his face. In school, he was bullied and isolated. He struggled to connect with classmates, and especially with girls who often rejected him. These years planted seeds of anger and resentment deep inside him. He worked long hours in his father's bakery and developed skills that he would later use when he opened his own business in Alaska. On the surface, he seemed dutiful and obedient, but inside, he felt small and powerless. As Hansen entered his teenage years, his resentment grew. He was consumed by fantasies of revenge against those who mocked him. At the age of 18, he enlisted in the Army Reserves and later worked as an assistant drill instructor. Even there, he struggled to fit in. His stutter and awkwardness made him feel invisible and unwanted. At the same time, he began developing a fascination with hunting. The woods became his escape. He became a skilled marksman and tracker. Hunting gave him a sense of control and power that he lacked in his social life. It would become the cornerstone of his identity. Hansen's early adult years were marked by trouble. In 1960, at the age of 21, he committed arson. He set fire to a school bus garage in Pocahontas, Iowa. He was caught and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He served only 20 months, but while incarcerated, he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and other personality issues. He received psychiatric treatment, but the underlying darkness inside him was never resolved. After his release, he tried to build a new life. He married a young woman, but the marriage soon collapsed. His inability to form stable relationships followed him throughout his life. By the mid-1960s, Hansen remarried, and in 1967, he moved to Anchorage, Alaska, with his new wife. At that time, Alaska was a frontier state full of opportunity for those willing to endure harsh conditions. Hansen opened a small bakery and built a modest life. He became known as a hardworking family man with children of his own. Neighbors saw him as quiet and unassuming. He also earned a reputation as an expert hunter. He broke state records for hunting and proudly displayed his trophies. To the outside world, Hansen seemed successful and ordinary. But beneath that mask, his bitterness and violent fantasies had only grown stronger. During the 1970s, Anchorage began to change. Oil money brought rapid growth. The city developed a busy nightlife that included bars, strip clubs, and sex work. Hansen began targeting women from this vulnerable community. He would pick up women, often sex workers or dancers. At first he paid them, but then his encounters turned violent. He began to kidnap them at gunpoint. He would take them to his home, where he bound and assaulted them. If he felt they might escape or report him, he escalated further. Hansen developed a chilling routine. He would load a woman onto his small private plane. He would fly her into the wilderness far from any road or settlement. There he would release her into the forest. But this was not freedom. Hansen would hunt her like game. Armed with a rifle and a knife, he tracked his victims through the cold, unforgiving terrain. He stalked them as they begged for their lives. Few ever escaped. The Alaskan wilderness became his killing field. For years, these crimes went unnoticed. Many of his victims were women whose disappearances were rarely investigated with urgency. The transient nature of Anchorage nightlife made it easier for women to vanish without immediate suspicion. Between 1971 and 1983, Hansen killed at least 17 women, though investigators believe the true number may have been higher. He buried some of them in shallow graves across the wilderness. He marked the locations on an aviation map with tiny X marks, as if cataloging trophies of his hunts. The investigation into Hansen began in the early 1980s after several women escaped his control. One woman reported being abducted at gunpoint and described Hansen's stutter and the weapons he used. In 1983, another woman escaped from his car, wearing handcuffs, and approached police. At first, investigators struggled to believe her story because Hansen seemed so respectable. He was a married father and a business owner. But detectives began to connect her account with reports of missing women. Alaska State Troopers and the FBI launched a deeper investigation. They conducted surveillance on Hansen and eventually obtained a search warrant. What they found was damning. In his home, they discovered weapons that matched ballistics from recovered victims. They also found jewelry belonging to missing women. Most chilling of all was the aviation map with marks scattered across remote areas of Alaska. When authorities searched those sites, they found the bodies of women who had been missing for years. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Hansen confessed. He admitted to abducting and killing women, but insisted that not all the marks on the map were graves. He eventually led investigators to the locations of some victims. His calm matter-of-fact descriptions of the hunts horrified detectives. He described how he gave women a head start before pursuing them through the wilderness. In 1984, Hansen was convicted of multiple murders as well as kidnapping and assault. He was sentenced to 461 years in prison plus a life sentence without the possibility of parole. He was sent to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Alaska, where he spent the rest of his life. In 2014, at the age of 75, Hansen died in prison from natural causes. The story of Robert Hansen remains one of the most terrifying in true crime history. His ability to live a double life as a quiet baker and family man while committing atrocities in the wilderness shows the depths of human darkness. His crimes also highlight the vulnerability of marginalized women and the dangers of unchecked violence in remote places. The Alaskan landscape that many saw as beautiful and free became under his hands a place of terror and death. This is the story of Robert Hansen, the butcher baker of Alaska, a man who turned the wilderness into his hunting ground and left behind a legacy of fear that lingers even after his death. Next story. I am going to tell you the story of one of the darkest crimes in Canadian history. It is the story of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka, a couple who came to be known as the Ken and Barbie Killers. Together, they carried out a series of crimes so brutal and manipulative that they left Canada in shock. Behind their picture-perfect appearances was a reality of abuse, sadism, and betrayal. Their victims were young, their crimes premeditated, and the aftermath one of the most controversial trials in the nation's history. Paul Bernardo was born in 1964 in Scarborough, Ontario. His childhood was troubled. His father was accused of sexual misconduct within the family, and his mother grew increasingly isolated, living in the basement while Paul was still young. Paul presented himself to outsiders as a charming, clean-cut boy. Teachers described him as polite and intelligent, but behind the mask, he developed a deep resentment toward women. By his teenage years, he was fascinated with violent sexual fantasies. He grew up into a handsome young man with blonde hair and boyish looks. Outwardly, he was the kind of man many would describe as ideal. But beneath this appearance was a manipulative predator who would soon begin a campaign of terror. By the mid-1980s, Paul was attending university. During this time, Scarborough was plagued by a series of brutal assaults. Women walking home at night were attacked by a man who followed them, dragged them into secluded areas, and assaulted them. The attacker became known in the media as the Scarborough Rapist. Police released composite sketches, and investigators gathered witness statements. Victims describe a young man with light hair and a calm voice, who seemed disturbingly polite even as he carried out the assaults. Unknown to the public, that man was Paul Bernardo. For years, he evaded capture, even when tips about his resemblance were called in. In 1987, Paul met Carla Homolka at a hotel restaurant. She was 17, he was 23. The attraction was immediate and intense. Carla was drawn to Paul's confidence and charm. Paul, in turn, found Carla unusually submissive and eager to please. Their relationship quickly grew into something more than romance. It became a partnership built on control, domination, and cruelty. Carla encouraged Paul's violent desires rather than rejecting them. Together, they formed a deadly bond that would soon target those closest to them. By the late 1980s, police had collected DNA samples from hundreds of men in the Scarborough area as part of their investigation into the rapes. Paul was among those tested. However, the backlog of samples delayed analysis. For years, his crimes remained hidden. Meanwhile, his relationship with Carla deepened. The couple became engaged, presenting themselves as a perfect love story. Friends and family saw them as a glamorous pair, destined for marriage. But within their private world, Paul demanded ever greater acts of submission. Carla, desperate to maintain his affection, complied. In 1990, Paul turned his attention to Carla's younger sister, Tammy. Tammy was only 15 years old. Paul expressed a disturbing fixation on her. Instead of resisting, Carla facilitated his desires. On the night of December 23rd, 1990, Carla and Paul drugged Tammy with animal tranquilizers stolen from Carla's workplace at a veterinary clinic. They filmed themselves assaulting her while she was unconscious. Tammy began to vomit during the attack, and despite attempts to revive her, she died. Paul and Carla called emergency services, claiming it was a tragic accident caused by alcohol. Authorities ruled her death accidental, and no investigation was pursued. Tammy was buried while her sister and Paul carried on their secret life. The following years brought more horror. In 1991, Paul and Carla abducted two teenage girls, Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. Leslie disappeared after being locked out of her home late one night. Paul and Carla lured her to their house, where they held her captive for days. They filmed themselves assaulting her before killing her and encasing her body in concrete blocks, which were later found in a nearby lake. Months later, Kristen French was abducted while walking home from school. She too was held captive, filmed, and murdered. These crimes spread fear across Ontario. Police searched for answers, but the killers remained hidden in plain sight. In February 1993, the investigation into the Scarborough rapist finally caught up to Paul. DNA testing had advanced, and samples collected years earlier now pointed directly to him. Detectives began surveillance. At the same time, Carla's relationship with Paul was deteriorating. He had grown increasingly violent toward her, and she sought medical treatment for injuries caused by his abuse. Fearing she would be implicated in his crimes, Carla approached lawyers. She struck a deal with prosecutors. In exchange for testimony against Paul, she would serve a reduced sentence. This agreement became known as the deal with the devil. Carla portrayed herself as a battered woman coerced into participating. As part of her testimony, she provided police with videotapes Paul had recorded. These tapes revealed the assaults in disturbing detail and showed Carla's active participation. The evidence left no doubt of her involvement, but by then her plea bargain had already been secured. Paul Bernardo was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, assault, and kidnapping. His trial in 1995 became one of the most high-profile in Canadian history. The jury heard evidence of the rapes, the murders, and the videotapes that documented the crimes. Paul was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for at least 25 years. He remains in prison to this day. Carla Homolka, by contrast, served only 12 years under her plea bargain. The public reaction to her release was one of outrage. Many believed she had escaped true justice, given her role in the crimes. After prison, she attempted to live under new identities and moved several times to avoid public backlash. Her presence in communities often reignited controversy and fear. The legacy of Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka is one of horror, betrayal, and unresolved anger. They shattered families, devastated communities, and exposed flaws in the justice system. The victims, young women with their lives ahead of them, were stolen in acts of cruelty masked by the smiling faces of a couple who looked to the outside world like the perfect pair. Beneath that image was darkness, so deep it remains one of the most haunting stories in Canadian history. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the most disturbing killers in recent American history. It is the story of Anthony Sowell, a man who came to be known as the Cleveland Strangler. Between 2007 and 2009, he murdered at least 11 women, hiding their bodies in his home while the neighborhood remained unaware of the horrors occurring next door. His crimes shocked the city of Cleveland and exposed both the depth of his cruelty and the failures of institutions meant to protect vulnerable people. Sowell's story is one of careful planning, predation, and the terrifying reality that a monster can live openly among ordinary people for years. Anthony Sowell was born in 1959 in Ohio. His early life was marked by instability and abuse. His family struggled financially, and his father was often violent, frequently drinking and expressing anger towards Sowell and his siblings. His mother tried to maintain some semblance of order, but the household was chaotic. From a young age, Sowell exhibited troubling behaviors. He was quick to anger, often aggressive toward peers, and showed early signs of antisocial tendencies. Teachers described him as bright but disruptive, and he was socially isolated. He struggled to form meaningful friendships and frequently acted out in ways that hinted at the darkness building inside him. During his teenage years, Sowell began experimenting with sexual activity, often coercive or aggressive toward girls his age. He also committed small thefts and became involved in fights, demonstrating a disregard for authority and boundaries. These early behaviors were warning signs that went largely unaddressed. As a young adult, Sowell cycled through a series of jobs and short-lived relationships. He married multiple times and fathered children, but his domestic life was characterized by control, jealousy, and violence. Neighbors often observed arguments and disturbances, but nothing indicated the horrifying crimes that would later come to light. By the mid-2000s, Sowell had become increasingly isolated. He moved into a modest home on Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. Outwardly, he maintained the appearance of a quiet, unassuming man. He would occasionally interact with neighbors, but kept to himself most of the time. Behind the walls of his home, however, he developed a methodical system of abduction, murder, and concealment. Sowell targeted women who were vulnerable, many of them struggling with addiction, poverty, or social instability. He would lure them to his home with promises of food, shelter, or companionship, exploiting their trust and need. Once inside his residence, Sowell would assault the women, often strangling them to death. The bodies were hidden in various parts of the home, including crawl spaces, closets, and the yard. Sowell's house became a tomb where the lives of his victims were extinguished and concealed. Despite the frequent presence of neighbors and visitors, Sowell's outwardly calm demeanor allowed him to blend into the community, leaving no outward clues of the atrocities inside. The combination of his planning and the vulnerability of his victims allowed him to operate undetected for years. The victims were women from marginalized backgrounds, many involved in sex work or struggling with substance abuse. Sowell carefully selected his targets based on perceived vulnerability and the likelihood that their absence would not trigger immediate concern. Some women were reported missing, but investigations were hampered by social stigma, understaffed police departments, and a lack of systematic follow-up. This allowed Sowell to continue his spree, confident that authorities would not connect the disappearances or discover the truth inside his home. The investigation that ultimately exposed Sowell began in August 2009. Neighbors complained about a persistent, foul odor emanating from his residence. Police responded to these reports and discovered human remains inside his home. The extent of the horror stunned investigators. Sowell was immediately arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. At the time of his arrest, it became clear that his crimes had been ongoing for years, with victims' bodies carefully hidden, some partially decomposed, others well concealed to avoid detection. During questioning, Sowell provided chilling confessions. He explained how he lured women, gained their trust, and ultimately killed them. He described his methods with a calm, almost clinical detachment. Detectives were horrified by the level of premeditation and the methodical way he had maintained concealment over the years. Each confession revealed the prolonged duration of his activities and the terrifying ease with which he moved among ordinary people while committing multiple murders. Sowell's trial began in 2011. Evidence included forensic analysis of the crime scenes, DNA testing, and testimony from surviving victims. Investigators presented photographs, physical evidence from the home, and expert testimony about his behavior patterns and methods. The prosecution argued that Sowell was fully aware of his crimes and had gone to great lengths to avoid detection, while the defense tried to present him as having a troubled upbringing that influenced his actions. The jury, however, was convinced of his guilt. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death, remaining on death row until his death in 2021 from natural causes. The aftermath of Sowell's crimes left a deep scar on Cleveland. The case revealed the vulnerabilities of women living in marginalized conditions and the dangers of social neglect. Families of the victims grieved deeply, expressing outrage at both the crimes and the systemic failures that allowed Seoul to continue unchecked. Social services, law enforcement, and community awareness were scrutinized, and efforts were made to improve protections for at-risk populations. Neighbors who had lived next to Seoul expressed disbelief and fear, reflecting on how a man living openly among them could commit such horrors without detection. Anthony Seoul's story is a reminder of the fragility of social systems designed to protect vulnerable people. It is a tale of a man who concealed his murderous impulses behind the mask of a quiet life, exploiting weaknesses in both society and the individuals around him. The victims, taken from communities already struggling with poverty and addiction, suffered in ways that society failed to prevent. Cleveland remembers the lives stolen by the Cleveland Strangler, a man whose cruelty and methodical predation left an enduring legacy of fear and sorrow. Next story. I'm going to tell you the story of one of the strangest and most chilling killing sprees in American history. It is the story of Herbert Mullen, a man who believed he was saving California from disaster by taking lives. In the early 1970s, he murdered 13 people in and around Santa Cruz. His crimes shocked a community already unsettled by other serial killers and left behind haunting questions about untreated mental illness, the failures of institutions, and the thin line between delusion and destruction. Herbert Mullen was born in 1947 in Salinas, California. His family later moved to the small town of Felton near Santa Cruz. From the outside, his childhood appeared normal. His father was a veteran and a stern but supportive figure, while his mother cared for the household. Herbert was described as polite and intelligent, though shy. He was an average student, well-liked by teachers. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. He struggled to connect with peers and often seemed withdrawn. In high school, when a close friend died in a car accident, the event left a lasting scar. He became fixated on death, increasingly anxious about the fragility of life. After graduation, he tried to build a normal future. He briefly attended college and considered a career in engineering. Yet by his early 20s, he began to show signs of severe mental illness. He heard voices, experienced paranoia, and grew convinced that disasters loomed. Doctors who examined him diagnosed schizophrenia. His family tried to help, but treatments at the time were inconsistent. Mullen moved in and out of hospitals, sometimes improving, sometimes declining. The social safety net of the late 1960s and early 1970s often failed those in need of long-term psychiatric care. Mullen slipped through the cracks. By 1972, his delusions had deepened. He became convinced that California was on the brink of a catastrophic earthquake. In his mind, human sacrifice was the only way to prevent it. He believed the voices told him when and where he must kill. To Mullen, these were not murders, but necessary acts of salvation. His descent into violence began with transients and strangers, people he believed would be acceptable sacrifices. Soon it escalated into random killings that brought terror to Santa Cruz County. The first known victim was a homeless man beaten to death with a baseball bat. Days later, Mullen stabbed a hitchhiker to death, leaving his body in the forest. These crimes attracted little attention at first. In the early 1970s, violence against marginalized people often went unnoticed. But as the killings continued, patterns of fear began to spread. Residents of Santa Cruz were already shaken because another killer, Edmund Kemper, was active at the same time. The quiet coastal region gained the grim nickname of murder capital of the world. Mullen's murders became increasingly brazen. He killed a man outside his own home, claiming he was sending him telepathic messages. He murdered a Catholic priest in his confessional booth, believing the act was divinely required. He shot and killed 4 teenagers who were camping in a state park, an act that horrified the entire community. Each time he was convinced he was preventing an earthquake. He often later explained that the voices had told him exactly what he needed to do. To the people of Santa Cruz, the killings seemed random, impossible to predict or prevent. Panic spread, and families began locking doors and keeping children close. The investigation into the murders was complicated because of their apparent randomness. Police initially struggled to connect the crimes. Different jurisdictions handled different cases. Witnesses described a disheveled young man in a beat-up car, but nothing more concrete. Mullen continued killing. He murdered a fisherman, then an older man in his driveway. At times he confessed to strangers what he believed he was doing, but most dismissed it as rambling. Only later would these admissions take on their terrible meaning. The spree came to an end in February 1973. Mullen killed a man in his front yard during a dispute. A neighbor witnessed the attack and quickly called police. This time officers arrived in time to apprehend him. He was arrested without resistance, almost relieved that the cycle had ended. In custody, he calmly explained that the voices had instructed him to perform the murders as sacrifices to prevent earthquakes. Investigators were stunned at the cold logic with which he described each killing. At his trial, the central question was insanity. His defense argued he was schizophrenic, driven entirely by delusion. The prosecution countered that despite his illness, he understood his actions were wrong and attempted to conceal them. The court heard testimony from psychiatrists on both sides. In the end, Mullen was found guilty of 10 murders and convicted of second-degree and first-degree charges. He was sentenced to life in prison. He has remained incarcerated ever since. The aftermath of Herbert Mullen's crimes left a community shaken. The randomness of his killings terrified residents who felt anyone could be a target. Families of victims grieved lives stolen without reason. The case highlighted failures in mental health care and the lack of consistent treatment for those with severe disorders. It also left Santa Cruz marked by its brief but devastating association with multiple killers operating at once. Mullen became a lasting example of what can happen when delusion and neglect converge. Herbert Mullen's story is remembered not for cruelty in the way of calculated predators, but for the unsettling reality of a mind consumed by madness. He was a man who believed he was saving lives while ending them. His crimes remind us of the fragility of the systems meant to protect the vulnerable and the dangers of ignoring signs of severe illness. In the end, 13 people lost their lives, and a community was left to wonder how many tragedies might have been prevented if help had come sooner. Next story. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons in a working-class family. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked as a bus driver, while his mother, Mary, was a retail sales clerk. The family lived a modest life, struggling financially at times, but always trying to maintain appearances of normalcy. From the outside, their household seemed unremarkable, yet within its walls lay tensions and patterns of dysfunction that would later be seen as critical to the making of a killer. As a child, Gary was shy and slow to develop academically. He struggled with reading comprehension and was held back in school more than once. Teachers noticed that he seemed detached, often staring off or failing to grasp lessons. His classmates sometimes mocked him for his lack of intelligence, and he grew up with a deep sense of inferiority. This sense of being less than others would stay with him for life, shaping the way he related to people. At home, the Ridgway family environment was strained. Gary's father often complained about sex workers, speaking of them with contempt. He frequently shared disturbing stories about encounters he had witnessed while driving his bus route near Seattle, where prostitution was common. At the same time, Gary's relationship with his mother was complicated. She was described as domineering, strict, and sometimes humiliating toward him. Gary later spoke of feeling confused by his mother's behavior, especially when she scolded him harshly, even as she also cared for him physically in ways that left him with troubling, conflicted emotions. As Gary entered adolescence, he began to show troubling signs of suppressed rage. At the age of 16, in what would later be remembered as a shocking foreshadowing of his adult crimes, he lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. The child survived, but the act revealed a dangerous side of Gary that no one around him truly recognized or understood at the time. It was brushed off as an isolated incident, and Gary moved forward with his life as though nothing had happened. After finishing high school, Gary joined the Navy. He was deployed to Vietnam. where he was exposed to the chaos of war and the widespread use of sex workers among soldiers. He contracted gonorrhea during his service, which filled him with a mixture of guilt and anger, emotions that later became tied to his view of women. When his military service ended, he returned to the United States and settled near Seattle. Gary Ridgway married young, taking a woman named Claudia Craig as his first wife in 1970. But their marriage was troubled from the beginning. He was jealous, controlling, and consumed by suspicions of infidelity. His fixation on sexual activity was overwhelming, and his expectations in the marriage were exhausting to his partner. They divorced within a year. He would marry more than once again, and in each relationship he displayed a disturbing pattern of obsession, control, and infidelity. On the surface, Ridgway lived a seemingly ordinary working-class life. He was employed as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he remained for decades. His co-workers described him as quiet, sometimes odd, but generally reliable. He attended church regularly and sometimes read the Bible aloud at home. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, he was nurturing dark fantasies and behaviors that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The murders that would later be attributed to him began in the early 1980s in the area surrounding the Green River near Seattle. In 1982, the body of a young woman was found in the river. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered, all of them women, many of them known to be sex workers or runaways. The victims were often strangled, sometimes with ligatures, and their bodies were left in wooded areas, ravines, or the river itself. The pattern became clear to investigators. They were dealing with a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his vehicle, murdered them, and then disposed of their bodies in clusters across the landscape. The press soon dubbed him the Green River Killer, a name that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades. The investigation quickly became one of the largest in American history. Task forces were formed, dozens of detectives and FBI profilers were assigned, and yet the killer remained elusive. Ridgway himself was interviewed as early as 1983. He admitted to knowing some of the victims and to picking up sex workers, but he was calm, cooperative, and passed a polygraph test. Without concrete evidence, the investigators let him go. Meanwhile, the bodies continued to accumulate. Throughout the 1980s, women kept vanishing from the Seattle area, many of them last seen near Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road notorious for prostitution. Their remains were later found in clusters in wooded dumping sites that Ridgway returned to more than once. He often revisited the corpses to perform acts of necrophilia, an element of his crimes that remained hidden until his eventual confessions. For years, the task force chased leads, investigated suspects, and tried new forensic methods. Among those who assisted was Robert Keppel, a detective who had previously investigated Ted Bundy. Bundy himself, sitting on death row in Florida at the time, even offered to help profile the Green River Killer. Bundy suggested that the killer likely revisited the bodies and that he chose vulnerable women because he knew their disappearances would draw less attention. At the time, investigators considered Bundy's insights, but still lacked the evidence to make an arrest. Ridgway's double life continued into the 1990s. He remarried, held his job steadily, and maintained a bland suburban existence. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, sometimes friendly, sometimes odd. Few suspected that the quiet man who mowed his lawn and attended barbecues was hiding the darkest of secrets. The break in the case came with the advancement of DNA technology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, samples that had been preserved from the victims were tested using new methods. Semen found on several victims was matched conclusively to Gary Ridgway. In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first murders, Ridgway was finally arrested. The arrest shocked those who knew him. Many could not reconcile the ordinary factory worker with the monstrous crimes. In custody, Ridgway eventually confessed to an astonishing number of murders. He admitted to killing at least 70 women, though he was only formally convicted of 49. His confessions revealed chilling details. He spoke matter-of-factly, with no visible remorse. explaining how he chose women he thought no one would miss, how he strangled them in his truck or home, and how he returned to their bodies long after their deaths. In 2003, Ridgway accepted a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation. He led investigators to previously undiscovered remains and described his methods in cold detail. The families of the victims attended hearings, listening as he recounted the deaths of their loved ones. For many, it was a devastating experience, but it also brought answers after decades of uncertainty. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without parole, serving his time at the Washington State Penitentiary. He remains there to this day, one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Story 2. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into a blue-collar family of Polish and Danish descent. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist who carried the scars of alcoholism and a violent temper. His mother, Marion, was described as a kind and protective woman who tried to shield her children from the worst of their father's anger. John Wayne, known in the family simply as Johnny, was the second of 3 children, with 2 sisters who were close to him throughout his life. From an early age, Gacy's relationship with his father was one of fear and disappointment. The elder Gacy often belittled his son, calling him weak and stupid, mocking him for not being athletic, and sometimes beating him for minor infractions. Johnny longed for approval that never came. Even as he grew older and achieved small successes, his father dismissed him. His mother, on the other hand, offered him compassion and defended him from his father's abuse. But this only deepened the wedge between father and son. As a boy, Gacy suffered from health problems. He experienced fainting spells and was later diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that limited his ability to participate in sports. This weakness made him a target of bullying from peers and further scorn from his father, who saw physical strength as a mark of manhood. These early wounds of rejection and humiliation would stay with him for life. Despite his struggles, Gacy showed an ability to charm and make friends. He had a sociable nature and often tried to win people over with humor and friendliness. By his teenage years, he became active in community organizations, working in grocery stores, and showing leadership qualities that impressed many around him. Yet behind this affable exterior, he carried secrets of confusion about his identity, his desires, and his insecurities. After finishing high school, Gacy moved through a series of jobs, eventually finding work in management positions. He married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, in 1964, and the couple settled in Waterloo, Iowa, where her family owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Gacy managed 3 of these restaurants, earning a good salary and presenting himself as a respectable young businessman. He joined the JCs, a civic organization where he rose quickly through the ranks, known for his enthusiasm and his ability to get others involved. But beneath this respectable exterior, Gacy harbored dark impulses. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy, an offense that shattered the image he had worked so hard to build. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and his wife divorced him, taking their 2 children and severing all ties. After serving just 18 months, Gacy was released in 1970 for good behavior. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life, but the seeds of his future crimes had already been planted. Back in Chicago, Gacy reinvented himself. He started a successful construction business, PDM Contractors, which specialized in painting, decorating, and maintenance. He remarried, this time to a woman named Carol Hoff, a divorced mother with 2 daughters. They moved into a house on Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood. To his neighbors, Gacy appeared to be a model citizen. He hosted parties, often cooking elaborate meals, and became involved in local Democratic Party politics. One of Gacy's most unusual hobbies was performing as a clown. He created 2 characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, sewing the costumes himself and painting his own face. He entertained children at hospitals, charity events, and parades, earning him the nickname the Killer Clown in later years. To those who saw him perform, he seemed harmless, even joyful. Yet this persona masked the terrifying reality of what was happening inside his home. Throughout the 1970s, young men and boys began disappearing in the Chicago area. Many of them were runaways, drifters, or youth-seeking work. Gacy often lured them with promises of construction jobs or money. Some he picked up hitchhiking, others he met at bus stations or on the street. Once inside his home, he would offer them alcohol or show them a trick involving handcuffs, claiming he could demonstrate how to escape. When they were restrained, he revealed his true intentions. He assaulted them, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies. The sheer number of victims is staggering. Over the years, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his house, layering the bodies in trenches that he dug himself. Others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. His ability to maintain his public image while committing these crimes is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Suspicion grew slowly. Some families of the missing reported seeing their sons last with Gacy, and rumors circulated. In 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest became the turning point. Piest was last seen at a pharmacy where Gacy had offered him a job. When he failed to return home, his parents alerted the police, who quickly connected his disappearance to Gacy. A surveillance operation was launched. Detectives followed Gacy, noting his erratic behavior and eventually obtaining a search warrant for his home. What they discovered shocked them. The smell of decomposition in the house was overwhelming. In the crawl space, they began to find bodies, one after another, buried in the earth. The scale of the crime was almost beyond comprehension. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. During questioning, he confessed in chilling detail to the murders. He spoke casually of how he killed the boys, describing them as if they were objects rather than human beings. The trial began in 1980 and lasted for weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, while the defense tried to argue insanity. But the jury was unmoved. Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in United States history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For years, he lived on death row at Menard Correctional Center, appealing his sentence and maintaining at times that he was innocent, at other times admitting to the crimes. He became a notorious figure, even creating paintings that were sold for high prices by collectors morbidly fascinated with him. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some celebrating, others reflecting on the horror of his crimes. His last words were dismissive, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a deep scar on the Chicago community and the families of his victims. His ability to live a double life, to be a businessman, a community volunteer, and a clown who entertained children, while at the same time burying dozens of bodies beneath his home, remains one of the most chilling examples of hidden evil. His case also led to greater awareness of the need for better investigations into missing persons, especially those from vulnerable groups. Story 3. The story of Peter Sutcliffe, later known to the world as the Yorkshire Ripper, begins in a quiet and ordinary setting, one that gave little hint of the darkness that would one day emerge. Born in Bingley, West Yorkshire, in 1946, Sutcliffe grew up in a working-class family in post-war England. His early life was marked by a somewhat withdrawn personality, a boy who seemed more comfortable in solitude than in crowds. Teachers and peers noticed that he was shy and sometimes awkward, but there was little outward sign of what was to come. The landscape of his childhood was one of smoky industrial towns, strict social structures, and families trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of war. As Sutcliffe grew older, those who knew him recalled a young man who seemed caught between the ordinary expectations of life and a deeper sense of disconnection. He worked various jobs, including in a factory and later as a truck driver, but he never seemed to settle. His relationships were strained, though he eventually married Sonia Surma in 1974, a woman who would remain by his side through much of the turmoil that was to follow. Their marriage was unusual, marked by long separations and a lack of intimacy, which only deepened Sutcliffe's sense of isolation. The crimes that would bring his name into infamy began in the mid-1970s. Between 1975 and 1980, women in the north of England began to be attacked with shocking brutality. Many were sex workers, living vulnerable lives on the margins of society. Others were simply ordinary women going about their daily routines. The killings were marked by a distinctive pattern, with the use of a hammer and a sharpened instrument that inflicted terrible injuries. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and deeply violent, leaving behind scenes of horror that confounded the police and terrified the public. The press quickly seized upon the fear, labeling the unknown killer the Yorkshire Ripper, an echo of the Victorian-era Jack the Ripper murders in London. The name stuck, and with it came a wave of public panic. Women across the north of England lived under a shadow of dread, avoiding nighttime travel, staying in groups, and fearing the possibility that the next victim could be anyone. The climate of fear grew so severe that it reshaped social life, particularly for women, and placed immense pressure on law enforcement to find the culprit. The investigation, however, was plagued by mistakes. The West Yorkshire Police launched one of the largest manhunts in British history, interviewing thousands of men, compiling endless files of information, and struggling under the weight of both public expectation and their own internal errors. A major setback came in the form of the so-called Wearside Jack hoax. A man with a strong Sunderland accent sent letters and tapes to the police claiming to be the killer. The police, convinced of the authenticity of the recordings, diverted significant resources to focus on suspects with similar accents. In reality, the letters and tapes were fraudulent, later proven to have been sent by John Samuel Humble, a man with no connection to the actual murders. This misdirection allowed Sutcliffe to continue his killings while the investigation drifted off course. By the end of the decade, the list of victims had grown. Women such as Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, and many more had lost their lives in horrifying circumstances. Some victims were young women with children, others elderly, some students or shop assistants. Each case carried with it grief and devastation for families and communities, while the broader society lived with the constant unease of not knowing when or where the killer would strike next. Despite being interviewed by the police multiple times, Sutcliffe managed to avoid capture. He explained away inconsistencies, charmed his way out of suspicion, and benefited from the disorganization of the investigation. Files were misplaced, connections were overlooked, and the sheer scale of the inquiry left gaps through which Sutcliffe slipped repeatedly. The frustration of the detectives mounted, and the anger of the public grew. Women's rights groups organized protests, demanding greater safety and accountability, and criticizing the police for failing to protect the vulnerable. The breakthrough finally came in January 1981. Sutcliffe was arrested in Sheffield after police officers noticed false number plates on his car. Inside the vehicle, they discovered tools that connected him to the series of murders. Further investigation revealed bloodstains, weapons, and other evidence that left little doubt as to his guilt. Once in custody, Sutcliffe confessed to many of the murders, speaking in a detached and almost casual manner that shocked investigators. He claimed that he had been commanded by voices, a supposed divine directive to rid the world of prostitutes. Whether this was a genuine delusion or an attempt to craft a defense is still debated, but it became a central element of his trial. In May 1981, Sutcliffe stood trial at the Old Bailey. The proceedings gripped the nation as the court heard testimony about the murders, the botched investigation, and Sutcliffe's mental state. His defense argued diminished responsibility, claiming he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, the jury rejected this, and Sutcliffe was convicted of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life terms in prison, a sentence later upgraded to a whole life tariff, ensuring that he would never be released. The aftermath of the case left lasting scars on British society. Families of the victims struggled with grief for decades, while the surviving victims bore the trauma of their attacks. The failures of the police investigation led to a major public inquiry, which criticized the West Yorkshire police for their mishandling of the case and recommended sweeping reforms. The Wearside Jack hoaxer was eventually unmasked and imprisoned years later, adding another tragic dimension to the story of misdirection and lost lives. Sutcliffe himself spent the rest of his life in custody, moving between prisons and psychiatric facilities. He was attacked several times by fellow inmates and lived under heavy guard. His health declined in later years, and he died in 2020 after contracting COVID-19, bringing an end to the life of a man whose crimes had cast a shadow over an entire generation. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most haunting chapters in British criminal history. It is a tale not only of violence and cruelty, but also of systemic failure, public fear, and the resilience of those who demanded justice. It reveals how the actions of one man can alter the lives of countless others, and how institutions meant to protect can falter under pressure. For decades, it has served as a cautionary reminder of the need for vigilance, fairness, and the protection of society's most vulnerable. Story 4. The story of Richard Ramirez, who would become infamously known as the Night Stalker, begins far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, in El Paso, Texas, where he was born in February 1960. He grew up in a troubled household, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father was strict and often abusive, and young Richard, called Richie by his family, began spending long hours away from home to avoid conflict. He slept in cemeteries as a child, he wandered the streets at night, and he grew up surrounded by influences that were anything but stable. From an early age, Ramirez was exposed to violence and darkness that would shape him forever. His older cousin, Miguel, was a Vietnam veteran who returned from the war with photographs of atrocities and stories of brutality. Miguel would show these images to the impressionable boy and brag about acts of violence he committed overseas. Even more horrifying, Miguel once shot his wife in front of Richard, an act of domestic murder that Ramirez witnessed firsthand as a teenager. This exposure to blood and death left a deep imprint. Ramirez's adolescence spiraled further into delinquency. He experimented with drugs, including LSD, and developed a fascination with Satanism, black magic, and horror. He idolized serial killers and murderers, studying their crimes as if they were role models. By his late teens, he was committing burglaries, drifting between jobs, and spending nights wandering city streets. Eventually, he left Texas for California, where the anonymity of Los Angeles provided the perfect landscape for his descent into crime. The wave of violence that earned him his place in history began in 1984. The first known murder linked to him was that of Jenny Vincow, a 79-year-old woman who was brutally attacked in her Los Angeles apartment. Her death bore the hallmarks of the savagery that would characterize many of his crimes: forced entry, overwhelming violence, and sexual assault. At first, the murder seemed isolated, but within months, the pattern grew. In 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by terror. Ramirez embarked on a spree of home invasions, murders, rapes, and assaults that appeared almost random in their targets. He attacked the young and the elderly, men and women, people of different races and backgrounds. No one felt safe because there was no clear profile of who might be next. He entered homes at night, often through unlocked windows or doors, and his victims woke to unspeakable violence. Some were shot, others stabbed, many bludgeoned. He left behind scenes of horror that investigators struggled to connect at first, but soon the public and police alike realized they were facing one of the most sadistic criminals in modern American history. Ramirez developed a ritualistic pattern. He used guns, knives, or blunt objects. He often assaulted women sexually, sometimes in front of their partners or children. He forced his victims to swear to Satan, leaving behind pentagrams drawn in lipstick or carved into skin. The press seized on these satanic connections, fueling fear that the Night Stalker was not merely a murderer, but part of something even darker. The city of Los Angeles descended into paranoia. Hardware stores sold out of locks and guns. People double-bolted doors, installed alarms, and slept with weapons nearby. The heat of the summer in 1985 made this even more difficult, as residents kept their windows closed in fear. Every creak of the night became a cause for panic. The randomness of Ramirez's targets made him particularly terrifying. Unlike other killers who focused on specific types of victims, Ramirez struck without pattern, so no one felt safe. The police worked tirelessly, but Ramirez proved elusive. He used stolen cars, switched weapons, and left behind little that could lead directly to him. He killed in Los Angeles, but also traveled north to San Francisco, committing murders there as well, widening the scope of the hunt. A breakthrough came when a fingerprint lifted from a stolen car matched Richard Ramirez, whose criminal record included prior arrests. His face was soon plastered across newspapers and television screens, and the entire state knew his name. The capture of Richard Ramirez was almost cinematic in its drama. In August 1985, a resident in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from a newspaper photo. By chance, Ramirez had entered a local store and noticed his own face staring back at him from headlines. He attempted to flee, but was chased by a group of local residents. They cornered him, beat him, and held him down until police arrived. The Night Stalker had been brought down not by elite detectives, but by ordinary citizens who refused to let him escape. His trial was one of the most sensational in American history. Beginning in 1989, it stretched on for months, marked by shocking testimony, graphic evidence, and Ramirez's own disturbing behavior. He frequently flashed a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouted "Hail Satan" in court, and showed no remorse. His demeanor made him both feared and strangely idolized. Some followers wrote him love letters and attended his trial, drawn to his image as a dark antihero. But for the families of his victims, the trial was an agonizing ordeal, forcing them to relive the horrors inflicted by a man who seemed to revel in their pain. Ultimately, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury sentenced him to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Even in prison, Ramirez remained a figure of fascination and revulsion. He married a woman who had written to him while incarcerated, though their relationship eventually faded. He lived under the shadow of execution for more than 2 decades, appealing his conviction but never escaping his fate. In 2013, before his death sentence could be carried out, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma, ending his life behind bars. The legacy of Richard Ramirez's crimes is one of terror, sorrow, and unanswered questions. His victims and their families live with scars that never fully heal. The communities he terrorized remember the summer of 1985 as a time when fear was constant, when the Night Stalker seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His case also changed the way Americans understood crime, highlighting the vulnerability of ordinary households and the randomness of violence. The Night Stalker remains a chilling symbol of predatory cruelty, a man whose actions revealed the darkest corners of human capability. His story endures not because of who he was, but because of the devastating impact he had on countless innocent lives, and a reminder of how fragile safety can be when confronted with evil. Story 5. The story of Dennis Lynn Rader, who became known to the world as the BTK Killer, begins in the small city of Wichita, Kansas, a place that for many years felt far removed from the kind of horrors that would eventually unfold there. Dennis Rader was born in March of 1945 in the tiny community of Pittsburgh, Kansas, before his family eventually moved to Wichita. From the outside, he seemed to grow up in an ordinary Midwestern household, with both parents working hard to provide for their children. Yet even in his childhood, troubling patterns began to emerge. He later admitted that from a young age he experienced violent sexual fantasies, often imagining scenarios where he bound and controlled women. These fantasies never disappeared. Instead, they grew stronger as he matured, becoming the foundation for the crimes that would terrorize Kansas for decades. Rader graduated from high school in 1963 and spent a brief time in college before enlisting in the United States Air Force. He served from 1966 until 1970, and after returning to Kansas, he attempted to live what looked like an ordinary life. He married his wife Paula in 1971, settled down in the Wichita area, found steady work first in a meat packing plant and later with an outdoor supply company, and eventually became a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita. He was also active in his church congregation, even serving as president of the church council. To neighbors and colleagues, he seemed strict and somewhat odd, but far from dangerous. No one could have imagined the hidden life he was leading. The first known murders attributed to Rader occurred in January of 1974, when he entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero and two of their young children. What unfolded that morning was an act of unimaginable violence. Rader bound each member of the family with cords and methodically killed them one by one. The brutality of the Otero murders stunned Wichita and immediately led police to believe a highly dangerous individual was at large. Yet investigators had few leads. There were no suspects, no clear motive, and no connection between the victims and a possible killer. The Otero murders might have remained an isolated tragedy, but soon afterward Rader made it clear he wanted recognition. In October of 1970, a local newspaper received a letter from someone claiming responsibility. The letter described details of the crime scene that only the killer could know. Most chillingly, the writer signed the letter with the initials BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill. That phrase would become inseparable from the crimes and the identity of the man who committed them. Over the following years, Rader struck again. In April 1974, he killed Catherine Bright, a young woman he attacked in her home after following her. 2 years later, in March 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian, a mother whose children he locked in a bathroom while he carried out the crime. In December of that same year, he killed Nancy Fox, an attack he later called one of his most significant. Rader continued to taunt police and media through letters and poems, always signing them BTK. His communications revealed a desire for notoriety and control. He wanted to ensure his crimes would not be forgotten and that his name would instill fear. Despite the communications, investigators struggled to identify the killer. The crimes appeared carefully planned, and the letters revealed a disturbing intelligence. Task forces were formed, tips poured in, but the identity of BTK remained elusive. By the early 1980s, Rader seemed to go quiet. In reality, he had not stopped having violent fantasies, but he began spacing out his attacks, making them harder to connect. In April 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just down the street from him. He later confessed to hiding her body in the church where he served as council president, posing her in different positions before disposing of her remains. In September 1986, he killed Vicki Wegerle, leaving behind her husband as the one to find her bound and strangled. At the time, police did not realize this crime was connected to BTK, and it was only later confirmed through DNA evidence. His final known murder occurred in January 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, again abducting her from her home and leaving her body in a rural area outside Wichita. After that, Rader appeared to go dormant. For more than a decade, there were no known BTK murders, and many in Wichita began to believe the killer had either died or moved away. During this time, Rader continued living his outwardly normal life. He raised 2 children, maintained his job as a compliance officer where he enforced petty city codes with almost obsessive rigor, and remained active in his church. Those who knew him described him as strict, rule-bound, and somewhat controlling, but nothing that pointed to a secret double life as a serial killer. Then in 2004, more than 30 years after the first Otero murders, Wichita received a shock. BTK resurfaced. A local television station received a package containing photographs and a copy of Vicki Wegerle's driver's license, stolen from the crime scene years earlier. This was undeniable proof that the killer was still alive and wanted attention once again. Over the next year, a series of communications arrived at media outlets and police, all from BTK. He sent packages containing crime scene items, letters describing his actions, and puzzles meant to taunt investigators. These new communications proved to be Rader's undoing. In one package, he asked police if they could trace information from a computer floppy disk. Investigators responded publicly through a newspaper ad suggesting it would be safe. When Rader eventually sent a floppy disk, forensic analysis revealed metadata linking the document to Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis Rader. Investigators quickly confirmed that DNA taken from Rader's daughter matched evidence preserved from earlier crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested near his home in Park City. The news stunned the community. This man who had lived among them for decades, enforcing local codes and serving as a church leader, was now unmasked as the BTK killer. During interrogations, Rader calmly confessed to the murders, describing them in chilling detail. He showed no remorse, instead speaking about them as projects he had planned and executed. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, though he hinted at more crimes that could not be conclusively proven. In court, he pleaded guilty, giving a long and detailed confession that described each murder step by step. His demeanor was cold and matter-of-fact, horrifying the families of victims who listened in the courtroom. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains today. His case continues to be studied for the way he maintained a double life, the methods he used to communicate with the public and law enforcement, and the failures and eventual success of the investigation that captured him. The aftermath of the BTK case left lasting scars on Wichita. For decades, families had lived in fear, never knowing who among them might secretly be BTK. The revelation that he was an ordinary neighbor and community leader was almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Next story. The story of Eileen Wuornos begins not in the chaos of her crimes, but in the turbulence of her early childhood. She was born in February 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, to a teenage mother and a father who would never play a role in her life. Her father was a convicted child molester who ended up in prison, later taking his own life, and her mother abandoned Eileen and her brother when Eileen was only a toddler. The two children were left to the care of their grandparents, a home that was supposed to provide safety, but instead became another environment of instability and abuse. Eileen's grandfather was a violent man, and her grandmother struggled with alcoholism. From an early age, Eileen experienced neglect, violence, and exploitation. By the time she was 11 years old, she had already begun trading sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and small amounts of money, surviving in a world that offered her no protection. She became pregnant as a teenager after being assaulted, and her baby was given up for adoption. Soon after, she was expelled from her home, left to survive entirely on her own. Her teenage years unfolded on the margins of society. She hitchhiked across states, lived outdoors, and engaged in sex work to sustain herself. Eileen's life became a cycle of transient relationships, brushes with the law, and survival through whatever means she could find. She was arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and disorderly conduct. The years hardened her, stripping away any sense of stability or belonging. By the late 1980s, Wuornos was living in Florida, still drifting and surviving as a sex worker along highways. It was there, beginning in 1989, that her violent crimes began. Unlike many serial killers who targeted specific groups for twisted psychological reasons, Wuornos' murders were bound up with her own life circumstances. She claimed she killed men who had picked her up for sex when they became violent or attempted to assault her. But prosecutors would later argue her crimes were calculated robberies, carried out under the guise of self-defense. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old man who picked her up along a Florida highway. In December 1989, his body was discovered abandoned in his car, shot multiple times. At first, the murder seemed like an isolated case, but over the next year, more bodies appeared. The victims were all men, found along roadsides or in wooded areas, killed with a gun, and often robbed of their belongings or vehicles. As the body count rose, eventually reaching 7 confirmed murders, fear spread through Central Florida. Police connected the killings by the consistent method and by witness descriptions of a woman seen with some of the victims shortly before their deaths. A key detail helped narrow the search. Wuornos and her lover, Tyria Moore, had crashed one of the victims' cars and fled the scene, leaving behind fingerprints. Those prints were traced back to Wuornos, already known to law enforcement for her long history of arrests. Investigators began a manhunt, but Wuornos was elusive, moving from cheap motels to bars, living in constant motion. In January 1991, police finally caught her at a biker bar in Daytona Beach. She was arrested without incident, though she maintained a tough and defiant demeanor. Her partner, Tyria Moore, became a crucial figure in the case. Pressured by investigators, Moore agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. She called Wuornos while under police surveillance, persuading her to confess to the killings. On tape, Wuornos admitted to several murders, repeating her claim that she acted in self-defense against violent clients. Her trial became a national spectacle. In 1992, she was tried for the murder of Richard Mallory, though evidence from other killings was also introduced. The jury heard not only about the crimes, but also about her troubled past, her years of abandonment and abuse. Yet prosecutors argued that her pattern of taking money, possessions, and cars from her victims showed her true motive. After only a short deliberation, the jury found her guilty of murder and she was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, Wuornos faced additional trials for the other murders, each ending in further convictions and death sentences. She became one of the rare women on death row in the United States. Her demeanor in court was unpredictable. At times, she appeared calm and resigned. At other times, she lashed out, shouting at the judge, jury, or prosecutors, declaring her hatred for society and her belief that everyone was against her. Wuornos' story drew wide attention, not just because of her crimes, but because of the complicated questions they raised. Some saw her as a victim of abuse and exploitation, a woman who had been failed by every institution meant to protect her, whose violence was an extension of the violence inflicted upon her. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who preyed on men and used her history as an excuse. Her life and crimes became the subject of documentaries, books, and eventually the film Monster, which dramatized her story. But behind the media portrayal was a woman who lived nearly her entire life in pain, anger, and alienation. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. In her final moments, she gave a rambling statement, referencing outer space, Armageddon, and her belief that she would return. She died quickly, ending a life that had been marked from childhood by violence and instability. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos remains controversial. To some, she symbolizes how cycles of abuse and neglect can create a person capable of great harm. To others, she is remembered simply as a killer who took innocent lives. What is undeniable is that her story stands apart in the history of American crime. A rare example of a female serial killer whose crimes gripped the nation and left behind endless debate about justice, responsibility, and the roots of violence. Her life reminds us how deeply environment and trauma can shape a person, but also how society struggles to reconcile sympathy with accountability. For her victims and their families, the question of motive mattered little compared to the irreversible loss they suffered. For true crime history, the name Aileen Wuornos remains forever etched as both a cautionary tale and a chilling story of violence born from a life of suffering. Next story. The story of John Wayne Gacy begins in the suburbs of Chicago, where he was born in March 1942 to a working-class family. From the outside, his childhood seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors, life was harsh and unforgiving. His father was an alcoholic with a violent temper who regularly belittled and beat him. His mother, though more nurturing, could not shield him from the constant abuse. Gacy grew up desperate for approval, especially from his father, yet he rarely received anything but criticism. As a child, Gacy suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his physical activity. He often felt like an outsider, excluded from sports, and overshadowed by his father's disdain. But beneath his fragile health and troubled home life, Gacy began developing the traits that would later define him: charm, manipulation, and a hunger for recognition. By his teenage years, Gacy began finding ways to fit in socially. He was known as friendly and eager to help, often volunteering for school and community projects. But his personal life already carried shadows. He struggled with his sexuality, something he kept hidden at a time when homosexuality was harshly judged. His need to maintain a public image while concealing his private desires would become a recurring theme throughout his life. In early adulthood, Gacy drifted into sales and business management, where his charisma proved useful. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and capable of winning people over. But cracks appeared quickly. In the 1960s, after marrying and moving to Iowa, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He served time in prison, where he earned a reputation as a model inmate, and was released after serving only a portion of his sentence. His wife divorced him during his incarceration, taking their children and leaving him to start over. When Gacy returned to Illinois, he reinvented himself. He became a contractor, starting his own business and employing local young men. He became active in Democratic Party politics, even posing for photographs with prominent politicians. He volunteered in the community, organizing parties and entertaining children while dressed as Pogo the Clown, a character he created. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed generous and dependable, a man who gave back to his community. But behind this mask, Gacy was living a double life of unimaginable horror. From 1972 to 1978, he lured dozens of young men and teenage boys to his home. Some were employees, others were hitchhikers or runaways, and some simply disappeared after meeting him. Once inside, Gacy used various ruses to trap his victims, including a so-called magic trick where he handcuffed them under the pretense of showing them an escape trick. What followed was torture, sexual assault, and murder. The scale of his crimes would not be fully understood until years later. Gacy disposed of many of his victims by burying them in the crawl space beneath his suburban home. When that space became overcrowded, he began discarding bodies in the Des Plaines River. For years, his murders went unnoticed, hidden by his outward image of respectability and civic involvement. Suspicion began to mount in 1978 after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, who was last seen leaving work to meet Gacy about a potential job. When police investigated, they quickly connected Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A background check revealed his prior conviction for sexual assault, raising alarm. Detectives began surveillance on Gacy, following him around the clock. As they built their case, they gathered witness statements and evidence linking him to other missing young men. The pressure mounted, and Gacy, increasingly paranoid, began drinking heavily and confiding strange things to friends. In December 1978, police executed a search warrant at Gacy's home. What they found was overwhelming. Beneath the house, investigators uncovered a gruesome burial ground. One body after another was exhumed, eventually totaling 29 victims buried on his property, with additional bodies recovered from the nearby river. The revelations shocked the nation. Gacy, the man who had dressed as a clown for children's parties and mingled with politicians, was now revealed as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The contrast between his public persona and his hidden crimes made the case unforgettable. Gacy was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial began in 1980 and quickly became a media sensation. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including confessions Gacy had made during interrogation and the remains of victims discovered in his crawl space. The defense attempted to argue that Gacy was insane, claiming he had multiple personalities and that one of them, not the man himself, had committed the murders. The jury was not convinced. After a short deliberation, Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, one of the highest confirmed victim counts for a single killer in the United States. He was sentenced to death. For more than a decade, Gacy remained on death row, filing appeals and granting interviews. In these interviews, he alternated between admitting guilt, denying involvement, and even blaming others. He painted himself as a scapegoat, a victim of lies, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final meal consisted of fried chicken, shrimp, and strawberries, and his final words were defiant, a reflection of the arrogance that had marked much of his life. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy is one of horror and betrayal. He was a man who hid his darkest crimes behind the painted smile of a clown, deceiving his community while committing acts of unspeakable violence. His case forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of facades, that a man who entertains children can also be capable of burying their peers beneath his own home. The Gacy murders remain a landmark case in American criminal history, a chilling reminder of how deception and cruelty can coexist within one person. For the families of his victims, the story is not about the bizarre details of his double life, but about the young lives cut short and the years of pain that followed. Even today, the name John Wayne Gacy evokes both fear and fascination, a symbol of hidden darkness and the limits of trust. His crawl space became a graveyard, his home a house of horrors, and his name one of the most infamous in the history of crime. Next story. The story of Richard Ramirez begins on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. From early childhood, Ramirez's life was scarred by violence and instability. His father, a former police officer in Mexico turned laborer in the United States, had a harsh temper. He frequently lashed out at his children, instilling fear rather than guidance. Richard was different from the start, prone to seizures and suffering from head injuries after repeated blows to the head. He struggled in school and became withdrawn. As a boy, he often slept in cemeteries to escape his father's wrath, finding comfort in the stillness of the night. But what might have been a shy, troubled boy soon began sliding towards something darker. A major influence in Ramirez's life was his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who returned home deeply scarred by combat. Miguel shared stories of brutal violence and even showed Richard photographs of Vietnamese women he claimed to have assaulted and killed. He glorified cruelty, and to a young Richard, these stories became lessons rather than warnings. When Richard was just 13, he witnessed Miguel shoot and kill his own wife during a domestic argument. Instead of recoiling from the horror, Ramirez seemed fascinated, absorbing it as part of his twisted education. By his teenage years, Ramirez had begun experimenting with drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD, while developing an obsession with Satanism. He gravitated toward darker influences in music, art, and literature. Petty crime became a routine, and he eventually dropped out of high school. He left Texas for California, where he slipped into a transient lifestyle of theft, drugs, and aimlessness. But behind the theft and wandering, a darker compulsion was growing, a drive for violence and domination. In 1984, Ramirez began what would become one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. His first known murder occurred that June, when he attacked a 79-year-old woman in her apartment, stabbing her repeatedly. Soon, his crimes escalated. Unlike many killers who targeted a specific type of victim, Ramirez attacked randomly. His victims included men, women, and children, ranging from young girls to elderly couples. He would break into homes at night, assault his victims, commit sexual violence, and often kill them with knives or guns. The randomness of his crimes made him uniquely terrifying. No neighborhood felt safe. Families locked their doors, bolted their windows, and slept in fear. The press began calling him the Night Stalker, a name that stuck and magnified the sense of dread. Ramirez reveled in the fear he created. During his attacks, he invoked Satan, leaving behind symbols and shouting phrases that amplified his image as a disciple of evil. He often forced his victims to swear loyalty to Satan or mock their faith. His methods were cruel and chaotic, sometimes shooting his victims, sometimes stabbing them, sometimes bludgeoning them. Survivors described him as tall, thin, with rotting teeth, smelling of decay, and having eyes that radiated menace. By the summer of 1985, California was in a panic. Ramirez's attacks stretched across Los Angeles and later into the San Francisco Bay Area. Communities set up neighborhood watches, police patrols increased, and gun sales soared. The randomness of his crimes left investigators scrambling. But Ramirez made mistakes. He left fingerprints, shoe prints, and eyewitness descriptions. A stolen car he abandoned eventually gave police the evidence they needed. In August 1985, his fingerprint was matched to a prior arrest record, and his identity was released to the public. His mugshot was printed on the front pages of newspapers across California. Only days later, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles and realized that everyone around him recognized his face. Panicked, he tried to steal a car and escape, but the local community chased him down. In a dramatic moment of street justice, a mob of citizens beat and restrained him until police arrived. The reign of the Night Stalker had ended, not at the hands of detectives, but by ordinary people who refused to let him escape. Ramirez was put on trial in 1989 for 13 murders, as well as charges of attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The trial was a media circus, drawing massive crowds. Ramirez appeared in court with long hair, dark sunglasses, and a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouting, "Hail Satan." His behavior shocked many, reinforcing the image of a man who embraced evil as an identity. The trial dragged on for years due to its complexity and the number of charges. Survivors and families of victims gave heart-wrenching testimony. Forensic evidence tied Ramirez directly to multiple crimes. Despite his lawyer's attempts, the jury found him guilty on all major counts. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. Upon hearing the sentence, he sneered and told the court that death was nothing compared to the forces he served, declaring that the real terror would come later. Ramirez was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained on death row for more than 2 decades. During his imprisonment, he developed a following of admirers, some drawn to his notoriety, others captivated by his embrace of Satanism. In 1996, he even married a freelance magazine editor who had become obsessed with him. But his life ended not with execution, but with illness. On June 7, 2013, at the age of 53, Richard Ramirez died of complications related to lymphoma while still awaiting execution. The Night Stalker case remains one of the most infamous in American history. Ramirez's crimes were not only about murder, but about terror itself, striking randomly, violating the sanctity of homes, and leaving behind communities paralyzed with fear. He embodied the nightmare of a predator who could come for anyone, at any time, without reason or pattern. For Californians who lived through that summer of 1985, the memory of locking doors, checking windows, and listening for noises in the dark remains vivid. Richard Ramirez left scars not only on his victims and their families, but on an entire state that lived under his shadow. His name has since become synonymous with pure, predatory evil. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the darkest chapters in modern crime history. Born in May 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey grew up in a home that was outwardly normal but internally fractured. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, battled her own struggles with mental health. From a young age, Jeffrey displayed signs of detachment from those around him. He was shy, withdrawn, and often preferred to be alone. What stood out to those who later reflected on his youth was a fascination with the dead and with animals in particular. Jeffrey would collect roadkill, study the bodies, and experiment with their bones. At the time, these habits were dismissed as odd, but not alarming enough to demand intervention. As Jeffrey entered his teenage years, his isolation deepened. Alcohol became his companion. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours, hiding liquor in the folds of his clothing or stashing it in lockers. His classmates sometimes laughed about it, but his drinking was a symptom of a deeper emptiness that was consuming him. He felt disconnected from people. At the same time, Jeffrey was beginning to struggle with his own sexual identity, and he later admitted that his urges were mixed with fantasies of control and domination. The pivotal moment that marked his first descent into murder came in June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation. His parents had separated, and Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. One evening, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Stephen was a young man heading to a rock concert, and he accepted Jeffrey's invitation to stop at the house for some drinks. At first, the atmosphere was friendly, but as the night wore on, Jeffrey realized that Stephen wanted to leave. Panic and desperation filled him because Jeffrey did not want to be alone again. He struck Stephen with a dumbbell and strangled him. This was the first murder. Afterward, Jeffrey dismembered the body and disposed of it in the woods behind the house. This act haunted him, but it also awakened something inside him that he would later admit he could not control. In the years that followed, Jeffrey tried to appear normal. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after only a few months. His drinking worsened, and his father forced him to enlist in the Army in 1979. Jeffrey trained as a medic in Germany. While stationed overseas, he continued to drink excessively. Some later reports suggested that he may have assaulted fellow soldiers, though these cases were never pursued in detail at the time. By 1981, he was discharged for his inability to function. With no stable direction, Jeffrey drifted between relatives and odd jobs. By the late 1980s, his impulses returned stronger. Living in Milwaukee in a small apartment, Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses. At first, he sought companionship, but his fear of abandonment twisted these encounters. He started drugging men to keep them unconscious during their encounters. Eventually, this progressed into murder once again. In 1987, he killed Stephen Twomey in a hotel room after a night of drinking. Jeffrey later claimed he awoke to find Stephen dead without memory of killing him, but this pattern of blackout, followed by violence, would repeat. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer embarked on a spree that would claim 16 more lives. His method was chillingly systematic. He lured young men and boys, often from marginalized communities, with promises of money or photographs. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies for days. In some cases, he performed disturbing rituals of dismemberment and cannibalism. He kept skulls and body parts as trophies, storing them in his refrigerator in a blue barrel filled with acid. His obsession was not only with killing, but with creating a permanent companion who could never leave him. He attempted crude experiments of drilling holes into the skulls of victims and injecting chemicals in hopes of creating a compliant zombie-like partner. Despite the horror unfolding inside his apartment, Jeffrey remained surprisingly unnoticed. Several near escapes highlight the tragic failures of authorities. One of the most striking occurred in May 1991 when a 14-year-old boy named Conorak, synthesum phone, managed to flee Jeffrey's apartment drugged and bleeding. Neighbors called police when they saw the boy wandering incoherently. Officers arrived, but Jeffrey convinced them that Conorak was his adult lover and that it was a private matter. The police accepted this explanation and left the boy in Jeffrey's custody. Within an hour, Jeffrey had killed him. These failures allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes until July 22nd, 1991, when another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Edwards was lured to the apartment, but once inside, he noticed the smell and saw the strange surroundings. Jeffrey attempted to handcuff him, but Edwards fought back and fled through the door. He stopped police officers on patrol and led them back to the apartment. When police entered, they discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, and soon after, the full extent of Jeffrey's actions was revealed. The arrest shocked the nation. Neighbors who had complained of foul smells and odd noises were horrified to learn what had been happening next door. The investigation uncovered remains of multiple victims, as well as the tools and containers Jeffrey had used. His calm demeanor during questioning unsettled investigators. He openly admitted to the murders, describing his rituals in clinical detail. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. Many of them were already living in difficult social and economic circumstances and now had to endure the public exposure of their loved ones' deaths. The trial began in January 1992 and drew international attention. Jeffrey pleaded guilty but insane. His defense argued that his mental illness drove his uncontrollable urges. The prosecution maintained that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he carefully planned his actions. After weeks of testimony, including graphic evidence, the jury found him guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms totaling nearly 1,000 years in prison. Prison did not bring peace. Jeffrey initially lived quietly behind bars, reading the Bible and speaking to chaplains. Yet other inmates viewed him with contempt. He sometimes mocked guards and prisoners by shaping his food into body parts, as if to relive his crimes. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver beat him to death in the prison bathroom. For many families, this ending felt like a final chapter, though it could never erase the pain. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to stir debates about mental illness policing and the vulnerability of marginalized groups. His crimes revealed systemic failures in law enforcement, who dismissed the concerns of neighbors and ignored the pleas of victims. It showed how predators can hide in plain sight, while institutions fail to protect those most at risk. Documentaries and books continue to analyze the case, but beyond the sensationalism lies the human cost. 17 lives were lost, each with families who still mourn. Story 2. Ted Bundy remains a name etched into the darkest pages of criminal history. Born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Bundy grew up in an environment of secrets. His mother, Eleanor, raised him with the support of her strict parents. For a time, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. The truth of his parentage remained confusing, and he grew up with an undercurrent of instability. Despite this, outwardly, he appeared intelligent, polite, and even charming. As a young boy, Bundy displayed early signs of detachment and fascination with control. Neighbors recalled that he sometimes placed knives around his aunt as she slept. He also developed a habit of peeping into windows and stealing items from homes. Still, these warning signs went largely unnoticed. He was a good student and seemed socially adept. Teachers saw him as quiet and well-mannered. In the 1960s, Bundy attended the University of Washington in Seattle. There he studied psychology and became politically active, volunteering for campaigns and working a crisis hotline. Colleagues at the hotline would later recall his calm voice and apparent empathy for callers in distress. Nobody suspected that he was already harboring violent fantasies. Bundy's murders began in the early 1970s, though it is believed he may have killed earlier. He targeted young women, often students who resembled a former girlfriend. He felt deeply rejected